Hey there, welcome to my channel. I just started this channel, and your support means the world to me. It helps me keep sharing the stories I love. This video is completely ad-free and designed to help you fall asleep fast and comfortably. Like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the kind of stories I share here. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's amazing to feel connected with all of you. Now, dim the lights, turn on a soft fan if you like, and let's drift into tonight's stories together. Story 1. I bought a used camera. The last picture was of me sleeping. The scent of a pawn shop is a unique perfume, a layered olfactory history of desperation, forgotten hobbies, and the faint, metallic tang of regret. It's a smell I've always found strangely comforting. I'm a photographer, but not the kind who chases the crisp, sterile perfection of digital. I'm a creature of the darkroom, a lover of film grain, light leaks, and the tangible magic of a silver gelatin print coming to life in a tray of chemicals. I hunt for relics, for cameras with stories baked into their brass and leather. My name is Jacob, and I believe that old lenses see the world differently, that they hold the ghosts of every image they've ever captured. I never imagined how literally true that could be. The shop was a dusty, cluttered cave on a forgotten side street, the kind of place you'd miss if you weren't specifically looking for the faded peeling sign that read, "Second Chances." I was killing time, waiting for inspiration to strike, a common affliction since my ex-girlfriend Chloe had moved out 6 months prior, taking the vibrant color palette of our shared life with her and leaving me in a world of muted grays. It was in the back, under a table piled high with defunct VCRs and sad-looking porcelain dolls, that I saw it. It was a Lichtner A7, a beautiful, brutish piece of German engineering from the 1960s. It was a rangefinder, heavy and solid, its black enamel worn to a soft patina on the corners, its lens a single, unblinking cyclops eye. It felt less like a machine and more like a dense, mechanical heart in my hands. The shopkeeper, a man whose face seemed to be made of intersecting wrinkles, gave me a rheumy-eyed look. "That one? Been here for ages," he rasped. "Found it in an estate lot. As is, of course." "Does the shutter work?" I asked, my thumb finding the familiar, satisfying resistance of the film advance lever. He shrugged, a gesture that moved his entire upper body. "Probably. Thing's built like a Panzer tank. $10. It was the kind of deal that makes your heart beat a little faster." I paid the man, feeling a thrill of discovery, a brief, bright spark in the monochrome landscape of my recent life. I took it home to my apartment, a third-floor walk-up with creaky floors and a view of a brick wall, the kind of place that's perfect for brooding artists and other assorted cliches. The real surprise came when I opened the back. There was a roll of film still inside. This was the holy grail for a junk shop connoisseur like me. A found history, a tiny orphan time capsule. The film was an old, off-brand black and white. The counter stopped at 24 exposures. I felt a giddy sense of voyeuristic anticipation. Who was the previous owner? What moments had they deemed worthy of capture? My bathroom doubles as my dark room. I sealed the door with a towel, the familiar, comforting darkness enveloping me. The smell of fixer and stop bath was my incense. I went through the ritual, my hands moving with practiced confidence in the dim, ruby glow of the safe light. I unspooled the film, clipped it, and submerged it in the developer. I watched the clock, gently agitating the tank, my mind racing with possibilities. An hour later, the negatives were hanging to dry, a glistening celluloid ribbon of someone else's life. I held them up to the light, my heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and a strange, almost reverent respect. The first 23 pictures were unremarkable. They were the anonymous, slightly melancholic photos of a life lived, a blurry shot of a child on a swing, a close-up of a cat's face, a rain-slicked street at night, the streetlights blooming like soft, ethereal flowers, several overexposed photos of what looked like the interior of an old, cluttered house. They were competent, but lonely. The compositions were slightly off, the subjects always distant. They felt like the work of a ghost, someone observing the world without ever truly participating in it. Then I looked at the last frame, number 24. My breath hitched in my chest. A cold, sharp icicle of dread seemed to pierce my sternum and travel down my spine. I took the negative strip and put it in the enlarger, needing to see it in stark, undeniable black and white. I focused the image, my hand suddenly clumsy and slick with a sweat I hadn't noticed. The image bloomed into life on the photographic paper in the developing tray, a ghost emerging from the chemical ether. It was a picture of me, sleeping in my bed in my apartment. The angle was from the foot of the bed, looking towards the headboard. I was on my side, my face half buried in the pillow. The details were so horrifically, intimately correct that my mind buckled under the weight of them, the specific, rumpled way my comforter was bunched up. The book on my nightstand, a collection of poetry Chloe had left behind, its cover clearly legible. The glass of water beside it, even the shadow cast on the wall by my bedside lamp, was perfect, a familiar nightly silhouette. My first thought was that it was a prank, an incredibly elaborate, cruel prank. My mind immediately went to Chloe, but this wasn't her style. She was practical, grounded. She wouldn't know the first thing about developing film, let alone staging something so violating. And we hadn't spoken in months. My other friends, none of them had a key. My second thought was more technical, a double exposure, a bizarre one-in-a-million fluke where my face had been superimposed over an image of an empty bed. I was a photographer. I knew the science. I could debunk this. I grabbed my loupe and examined the negative again, my heart thumping a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs. The grain was consistent. The light source was singular. The shadows were perfect. It was a single, unmodified, horrifyingly real photograph. My apartment, which had always felt like a sanctuary, a shell I could retreat into, suddenly felt violated, porous. The air itself felt thick with a hostile presence. I walked into my bedroom and stood at the foot of the bed, my eyes darting around the room. The perspective matched perfectly. The photographer had been standing right here, in my room, while I slept. Who had owned this camera, and how, in the name of all that was sane and logical, had they taken a picture of me before I had even bought it? The film had been in the camera when I found it. The thought was a paradox, a Mobius strip of impossibility that my rational mind couldn't navigate. That night, sleep was a foreign country I couldn't find a visa for. I sat on my sofa, the lights on, the Lichner A7 on the coffee table in front of me. It wasn't just a camera anymore. It was a witness, an accomplice. It seemed to watch me with its single glass eye, its black body absorbing the light, giving nothing back. I felt a primal, superstitious urge to smash it, to shatter its lens and exorcise whatever malevolent history it held. But I was also a photographer. It was a beautiful object, and a deeper, more frightening part of me needed to understand. I wedged a chair under the doorknob, a flimsy, pathetic defense against an intruder who had seemingly already bypassed all logic and security. Every creak of the old building, every siren in the distant city was the sound of them coming back. I must have eventually drifted off because I woke up with a jolt, my neck stiff. The gray, unforgiving light of dawn filtering through the blinds. The first thing I did was check the chair. It was still there. I was alone. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave with the night. It clung to me like a damp shroud. At my job, a soulless but necessary gig retouching real estate photos, I couldn't focus. I kept seeing movement in the corners of my screen. I'd glance over my shoulder in the office, convinced someone was standing behind me. I spent my lunch break in a frantic, paranoid online search. I typed in Lixner A7 and strange photos. I waded through forums of camera collectors, their posts filled with arcane discussions of shutter speeds and lens coatings. And then I found it. A single cryptic post on an obscure German photography forum dated from 10 years ago. The post was titled Schattenkamera, Shadow Camera. The user, who went by the name Collector88, wrote about a legend associated with a small specific batch of Lichtner A7s produced in the winter of 1963. The legend claimed the lenses were made with a new type of quartz-infused glass mined from a strange, geologically unique site in the Black Forest. The cameras, the legend went, didn't just capture light. They captured something else, an echo, a premonition. The post called them Seelenfängers, soul catchers. It mentioned the original designer, a man named Klaus Richter, who had become a recluse and died in a mental asylum, obsessed with the idea that his cameras were showing him pictures of things that hadn't happened yet. The post ended with a chilling single line. There are stories of owners disappearing, leaving behind only the camera and a final, undeveloped roll of film. I felt a wave of nausea. This was insane. Urban legends, internet ghost stories. But the story had the chilling ring of a truth I didn't want to acknowledge. That night, my paranoia graduated to active measures. I bought a new, heavy-duty deadbolt for my door. I installed a cheap, motion-activated webcam on my bookshelf, aimed at my bed. I was turning my home into a fortress, but I felt more vulnerable than ever. I took the Lixner and locked it in a metal footlocker in my closet, as if I could contain its curse through simple physical confinement. For a week, there was nothing. The webcam recorded nothing but 8 hours of me sleeping fitfully. The feeling of being watched began to recede, replaced by the weary, self-mocking thought that I had let a strange coincidence drive me to the brink of a nervous breakdown. I almost convinced myself it was all in my head. Then I came home from work to find the footlocker in my closet open. I stared at it, my blood turning to ice water. The lock was not broken. It was unlocked. I knew with an absolute gut-wrenching certainty that I had locked it, and inside, sitting innocently on a pile of old sweaters, was the Lixner. I backed out of the closet, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Someone had been here, again. But the new deadbolt on my front door was still locked from the inside. The windows were all latched. There was no way in. My eyes fell on the webcam. I scrambled to my laptop, my hand shaking so badly I could barely type my password. I opened the security footage from the day. I fast-forwarded through the long, empty hours of my vacant apartment. Nothing. No movement. No intruders. The footlocker remained closed and locked. I replayed it, watching the timestamp in the corner. Then I saw it. At exactly 3:33 p.m., the video feed flickered. For a single frame, the screen went to black static. When the image returned, a millisecond later, the footlocker was open. It hadn't been opened. It had just become open, as if reality itself had been briefly edited. A single, crucial frame of the film of my life snipped out, leaving a seamless, impossible jump cut. With a sense of dread so profound it felt like I was moving underwater, I picked up the camera. The film counter, which had been at 0, now read 1. A new picture had been taken. I didn't want to see it. Every cell in my body screamed at me to take the camera and throw it into the deepest part of the river. But I had to know. I was a prisoner to this thing, and the only way out was to understand the nature of my cell. Back in the dark room, the ruby light felt less like a comfort and more like the glow of a hellish fire. My hands trembled as I developed the single frame. The image that emerged was worse than the first. It was a picture of me in the shower. The photo was taken through the frosted glass of the shower door, my form a blurry, vulnerable silhouette. But the detail was still cruelly precise. The specific brand of shampoo on the shelf. The small, crescent-shaped scar on my left shoulder. The angle was from inside the small, windowless bathroom. It was a picture of a private, unguarded moment taken by an invisible, impossible voyeur. The camera was no longer just showing me the past. It was actively documenting my present. It was with me, always. The next few weeks were a descent into a private waking nightmare. The pictures kept appearing, one every few days. A single frame would be exposed on whatever roll of film I had in the camera. I tried leaving it empty, but a new, unexposed negative would simply materialize inside it. A picture of me at my desk at work, taken from over my shoulder. A picture of me buying groceries, taken from the other end of the aisle. A picture of me on the phone with my mother, my face etched with a fake, cheerful smile as I lied and told her everything was fine. Each one was a new violation, a new piece of evidence that my life was no longer my own. The photographer was a ghost, a demon, a glitch in the matrix. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was intimately, malevolently connected to the listener. I tried to get rid of it. I drove 40 miles out of the city and threw it into a landfill. I came home, exhausted and relieved, to find it sitting on my pillow. I smashed it with a hammer, the lens shattering, the body dented and broken. The next morning, it was on my kitchen table, fully repaired without a single scratch. It was a part of my life now, a tumorous, malignant growth that I could not excise. I stopped sleeping. I survived on coffee and fear, my eyes bloodshot, my hands in a perpetual state of tremor. My work suffered. My friends called, their voices full of a concern that I could not answer without sounding like a raving lunatic. I was an island, and the waters were rising. The pictures began to change. They were no longer just of me. A photo appeared of Chloe walking down the street, her face a mask of worry. She was walking towards my apartment building. A few hours later, my buzzer rang. It was her. "Jacob, I've been calling you for a week." she said, her voice tight with a mixture of anger and concern. "Are you okay? You look terrible." I couldn't let her in. I spoke to her through the intercom, my voice a ragged croak, telling her I had the flu, that I was fine, that she should go. The hurt in her eyes, even through the tiny, distorted camera, was a physical blow. The camera wasn't just tormenting me. It was using the people I cared about to do it. It was isolating me, turning me into the monster they would all remember. And then the pictures began to show the future. It started with a photo of a broken plate on my kitchen floor, shattered into a dozen pieces. I spent the entire day in a state of high alert, refusing to go near my kitchen cabinets. That evening, as I was making coffee, a sudden, inexplicable tremor shook the building. A low, deep rumble from a passing construction truck on the street below. A plate vibrated off the shelf and shattered on the floor in the exact pattern as the photograph. My blood ran cold. The camera wasn't just a voyeur, it was an oracle, a prophet of mundane and perhaps not so mundane doom. It was showing me a script, a future that was already written, that I was powerless to change. My free will was an illusion. I was just an actor, hitting my marks in a horror movie written by a malevolent mechanical god. I knew, with a certainty that settled in my bones like a terminal cancer, that a final photograph was coming. The one that would explain everything, the one that would show me how it all ended. It appeared 3 nights ago. I developed it with the slow, resigned dread of a man walking to the gallows. The image that emerged from the developer was a culmination of all my fears, a perfect, monochrome distillation of the horror that had consumed my life. The perspective was my own. It was a photo taken from my point of view. My own hands were visible in the bottom of the frame, holding the Lixner camera. The camera was pointed down at the floor of my living room. Chloe was lying there, her eyes wide and staring at the ceiling, a dark, spreading stain on the front of her white blouse. In the corner of the frame, I could see the tip of my own shoe, and next to it, on the floor, was a knife. I stared at the photograph, a low, keening sound of pure despair escaping my lips. It wasn't going to just kill me. It was going to use me. It was going to turn me into a murderer. It was going to take the last person I had ever loved and make me destroy her. And it was going to document the act with its cold, passionless, quartz-infused eye. The final photograph wouldn't just be of a death, it would be my confession. I called her. My voice was a frantic, broken thing. "Chloe, listen to me. Don't come here. Whatever you do, do not come to my apartment. I don't care what you hear. I don't care if I call you and beg. Stay away." "Jacob, what's wrong?" she cried. "You're scaring me. Let me come over. Let me help you." "No," I screamed, and I slammed the phone down. I threw it against the wall, shattering it. I had to break the chain of prophecy. For 2 days, I sat in my apartment, a prisoner of a future I was desperately trying to avoid. I boarded up the door with a hammer and nails. I sat on the floor in the dark, the Lixner in my lap, its cold weight a constant, terrible reminder. I waited. Last night I heard a pounding on my door. "Jacob, it's me. The landlord let me into the building. I know you're in there. Please, just let me see you're okay." It was Chloe. My frantic, insane warnings had, of course, had the opposite effect. They had convinced her I was in danger and that she needed to save me. The prophecy was fulfilling itself. The final act was beginning. I could feel it then, a cold alien sensation seeping into my arms, into my hands. The camera in my lap felt like it was humming, vibrating with a low, hungry energy. An impulse that was not my own told me to stand up, to go to the door, to let her in. I am writing this now, scrawling these words on the back of old photographic prints with a piece of charcoal from my art supplies, because I don't have much time. I can feel my will eroding, my own thoughts being drowned out by a cold, quiet, calculating intelligence that is not mine. It wants the picture. It has been building to this moment, to this perfect, tragic composition. Chloe is still outside my door. She's been talking to me for hours, her voice growing hoarse, pleading with me. And the other voice, the one inside my head, is getting stronger. It's telling me how beautiful the final print will be, the chiaroscuro of the shadows in the room, the tragic, poetic horror of the scene. It's a masterpiece, it tells me, the greatest photograph ever taken. The camera is in my hands now. It feels so heavy. My fingers are moving towards the nails I hammered into the door. I don't want to do it. I am screaming inside my own mind, a silent, unheard shriek. But my body is beginning to move. It's a slow, jerky, puppet-like motion, my muscles obeying a will that is not my own. The entity that lives in this camera, the ghost of Klaus Richter, or whatever ancient, hungry thing he woke up in that forest, it doesn't just capture moments. It creates them. It feeds on them. It feeds on despair. Chloe is calling my name, the name of the man I used to be. My hand is on the first nail. It's cold, sharp. I can see the final picture in my mind's eye, as clear as if it were already developed and hanging on a gallery wall. It is a work of undeniable soul-destroying art, and it will be my last testament. I don't know if I can stop it. I am raising the hammer. All I know is that the shutter is about to click. My wife died 3 years ago. She just texted me, "I'm home." The text arrived at 11:17 p.m. on a Tuesday, a night so ordinary it was practically invisible. I was in my usual state of suspended animation, half sprawled on a sofa, the bluish, flickering light of a forgotten documentary on the television painting the room in shifting, melancholic hues. My name is Daniel, and for the past 195 nights, not that I was counting, my life had been a meticulously curated museum of grief. Each object in our small two-bedroom house was a relic, a testament to the vibrant, chaotic, and now deafeningly silent life I had shared with my wife, Clara. The half-finished novel on her bedside table, the ridiculously oversized coffee mug she loved, the faint, phantom scent of her jasmine perfume that I could still sometimes catch in the hallway closet. These were the ghosts I had chosen to live with. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, a jarring, intrusive sound in the quiet. I glanced at the screen, expecting a late-night work email or a spam message about an extended car warranty, but the name that glowed in the darkness was a ghost of a different kind. It was a name I hadn't seen on my screen in 3 years. Clara. My heart, a sluggish, hibernating thing, gave a sudden, hard, painful jolt, like an engine seizing and then violently restarting. It was an old contact, a digital ghost I hadn't had the strength to delete. It was a pocket dial from her mother, perhaps, who still had her old phone. A cruel, random glitch in the matrix. I was about to dismiss it, to toss the phone back onto the table, when I saw the message preview. 2 words, 2 simple, impossible, and utterly soul-shattering words. I'm home. I stared at the screen, the world narrowing to the small glowing rectangle in my hand. The air in the room grew thin and sharp. The sound from the television faded into a dull, meaningless roar. I read the words again and again. They did not change. They did not disappear. My first thought was a desperate, grasping lunge for a rational explanation, a sick prank. Someone had gotten a hold of her old number. It was a new feature of the phone company, reassigning dormant numbers. Some stranger, a teenager with a cruel sense of humor, was messing with me. It was a vile, disgusting thing to do, but it was logical. It was explainable. With a trembling thumb, I opened the message thread. The last message I had sent to her 3 years ago was still there, a heartbreaking digital monument to a conversation that would never be finished. Leaving the hospital now? Pick up some milk on your way home? Love you. She had never made it home. A drunk driver had run a red light a block from our house. Above that old sad message was the new one. I'm home. My fingers, clumsy and slick with a sudden cold sweat, typed out a reply. Who is this? I hit send. The message was delivered, and then the 3 little dots, the pulsing, electronic heartbeat of a reply in progress, appeared on the screen. The prankster was quick. The reply came a moment later. It was a single, devastating word. Clara. I was expecting a laugh, an admission, an insult. Not this calm, simple, impossible assertion. My second thought, the one that slithered in after the rational explanation had been shot down, was that I was losing my mind, that the grief, the loneliness, the sheer crushing weight of the last 3 years had finally fractured my sanity. I was hallucinating. This wasn't real. I was having a psychotic break, and my brain, in a final act of desperate, self-destructive longing, had manifested this cruelest of all possible mirages. I stood up, my legs unsteady. I walked into the kitchen and splashed cold water on my face, the shock of it a welcome, grounding sensation. I looked at my reflection in the dark kitchen window. A pale, haggard, and decidedly sane-looking man stared back. I was not crazy. The phone buzzed again. Another message from Clara. I walked back to it. A man walking towards an execution he had inexplicably scheduled for himself. This message was longer. The key isn't working. The lock must be rusted. Can you let me in, Sleepyhead? Sleepyhead. It was her pet name for me, a gentle, teasing jab at my love of sleeping in on weekends. It was a detail, a small, intimate, and perfect detail that a random prankster could not possibly know. A wave of fear so profound it was almost nauseating washed over me. I looked at the front door. The deadbolt, which I had locked hours ago, was still firmly in place. I crept to the peephole, my heart a frantic trapped bird against my ribs. I put my eye to the cold brass ring and looked out. The porch was empty. The street beyond was silent and still, bathed in the fuzzy orange glow of the streetlights. There was no one there. My mind was a screaming chaos of impossible possibilities. Was this a ghost? A spirit? Somehow manipulating the digital world? Was this a test? A cruel, elaborate game being played by a god I no longer believed in? I typed another reply, my fingers fumbling on the small glass keys. This isn't funny. Stop it. The 3 dots appeared immediately. The reply was instantaneous. Why are you being so weird, Danny? It's cold out here. Just open the door. Danny, not Daniel. Only she had ever called me that. Another detail. Another perfect, tiny, and impossibly real nail in the coffin of my sanity. And then I heard it, a sound from outside. A soft, hesitant three-beat knock on the front door. Knock, knock, knock. I stumbled back from the door, a choked, guttural cry of pure terror escaping my lips. This was not a digital ghost. This was not a prank. This was real. There was someone or something on my porch, and it knew the things that only my dead wife could know. I didn't answer the door. I ran upstairs, my breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. I locked myself in the bedroom, the room that was still so full of her, and I wedged a chair under the doorknob. I huddled on the bed, my phone clutched in my hand, a useless, terrifying tether to the nightmare that was unfolding. The messages continued. Is everything okay? You're scaring me. Danny, please, I just want to come home. I had a bad dream. I need you. Each message was a new, expertly targeted emotional missile, designed to bypass my fear and hit the raw, exposed nerve of my grief, my love, my protective instinct. It was a masterful, cruel, and deeply personal psychological assault. And then a new message appeared, one that finally, irrevocably, shattered my last, desperate hope that this was some kind of elaborate terrestrial hoax. It was a picture, a photograph, taken just seconds ago. It was a selfie. It was a picture of Clara. But it was not the Clara I remembered. It was not the vibrant, laughing, sun-kissed woman from my memories. This was a pale, spectral, and terrifyingly changed version of her. She was standing on our porch, her face illuminated by the stark, unforgiving light of a phone screen. Her eyes were the same, a deep, beautiful cornflower blue. But they were wrong. They were empty. They held no light, no life, just a flat, placid, and deeply unsettling calm. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her hair, which had always been a wild, chaotic mane of auburn curls, was lank and dark, as if wet. And her smile, she was smiling, but it was a pained, unnatural stretching of her lips, a rictus of a smile that did not reach her dead, empty eyes. Behind her, I could see the familiar, reassuring details of my own front porch, the potted fern, the welcome mat, the small hairline crack in the porch light. It was her. It was my Clara. But it was a version of her that had been somewhere else, somewhere cold and dark and quiet, for a very, very long time. I stared at the picture, a low, keening sound of pure animal despair escaping my lips. The grief I had so carefully managed for 3 years, the grief I had compartmentalized, the grief I had learned to live with came roaring back, a tidal wave of raw, unprocessed agony. It was not a prank. It was not a dream. It was my wife. And she had come back from the dead. The knocking started again, louder this time, more insistent, and her voice, a faint, muffled, and horrifyingly familiar sound, came through the thick wooden door. "Danny, please, let me in. I'm cold." I spent the rest of the night huddled in that room, a trembling, weeping mess, as the thing on my porch, the thing that wore my wife's face, alternated between gentle, loving persuasion and a cold, angry, demanding rage. The messages became more erratic, more desperate. "I don't understand what's wrong. This is our home. Who is in there with you? Is it her? I died for you. You owe me this." The last message, a scream of pure accusatory rage in stark, capital letters, was followed by a silence that was more terrifying than the noise had been. I stayed in that room until the first gray, uncertain light of dawn began to filter through the blinds. When I finally, tentatively, crept downstairs, the house was silent. The porch was empty. There was no sign that anyone had ever been there, except for one small, impossible thing. On the welcome mat, there was a single, long strand of dark auburn hair. I was living in a ghost story. But it was a ghost story with a data plan. The next day was a blur of sleepless, paranoid terror. I called the phone company. The number that had belonged to Clara's phone had, as I suspected, been taken out of circulation after her death. It had not been reassigned. It did not exist. I was receiving messages from a phantom number, a digital ghost. I called the police. I tried to explain, my voice a shaky, unconvincing mess. A man receiving threatening texts. It was a common enough complaint, but when I told them who the texts were from, the polite, professional mask of the officer on the other end of the line slipped into a look of profound, pitying concern. He suggested I speak to a grief counselor. He suggested I get some rest. He did not suggest he send a squad car. I was alone with this. That night, she returned. The text, the knock, the voice, the whole terrifying, heartbreaking ritual. And again, I locked myself away, a prisoner in my own home, a man being haunted by a technologically savvy and deeply persistent ghost. The messages began to change. They were no longer just about getting into the house. They were about us. She sent me old pictures of us, pictures that had been on her phone when she died. A picture of us on our honeymoon in Italy, grinning like idiots, a smear of gelato on my nose, a picture of us on this very sofa, asleep, her head on my chest. They were weapons perfectly chosen to inflict the maximum amount of emotional damage. And then she began to send me new pictures. Pictures taken from outside the house. A shot of me through the living room window, my face illuminated by the television. A picture of the back of my head taken from the street as I sat in my study. She was not just on the porch, she was all around me. A silent, watching, and deeply patient predator. I was coming apart. I was a man living on a diet of coffee and terror. I was beginning to see her everywhere. A glimpse of an auburn-haired woman in a crowd would send my heart into a frantic, panicked gallop. The sound of a phone buzzing in a quiet room would make me jump out of my skin. I knew I couldn't go on like this. I was being psychologically dismantled piece by painful piece. I had to confront it. I had to understand what it was and what it wanted. My first thought was that this was some kind of punishment, that her spirit was restless, angry at the drunk driver who had killed her, at the universe that had allowed it. But her anger seemed to be directed at me. "You owe me this," she had said. Why? What did I owe her? I began to sift through the wreckage of our life together, looking for an answer. I went through her old things, her letters, her journals. Clara had been a writer, a poet. Her journals were filled with her beautiful, lyrical, and sometimes painfully honest observations on the world, on us. And in the last journal she had ever kept, in an entry dated the week before her death, I found it. A secret she had never shared with me. She had been pregnant. I stared at the words, my vision blurring with a fresh, new, and infinitely more painful wave of tears. A baby. We had been trying for years. It had been the one deep and unspoken sadness in our otherwise happy life. And she had been about to tell me. The entry was a rehearsal, a practice run of the speech she was going to give. "Danny," it began, "we're going to have to get a bigger house." The grief that hit me was a physical thing, a crushing weight that stole the air from my lungs. Not just her, but a child, a future, a whole entire life that had been stolen from me before I had even known it existed. And I understood. Her rage, her persistence, was not the rage of a spirit who had been cheated of her own life. It was the rage of a mother who had been cheated of her child's. And her words, "You owe me this," they were not an accusation. They were a plea. She didn't want revenge. She wanted her child's life back, and she thought somehow that I could give it to her. That night, when the text came, I was ready. I didn't run. I didn't hide. I walked to the door. "I'm here, Danny. Please, it's time to come home." The knock, soft, gentle. I took a deep breath. My hand was on the deadbolt. My heart was a slow, heavy, and steady drum. I was no longer afraid. I was just profoundly and deeply sad. "I know what you want, Clara," I said, my voice a low, steady thing, speaking to the wood of the door. "I know about the baby. I'm so sorry. I am so sorry we didn't have more time." The knocking stopped. The silence on the other side of the door was a living, listening thing. "But this is not the way," I continued, tears streaming down my face. "You can't come in. This is the world of the living, and you are not a part of it any more. Neither of you are." A low, soft, and utterly heartbroken sob came from the other side of the door. It was the first real and truly human sound I had heard from her. "But this is our home," she whispered, her voice a thin, fragile, and ghostly thing. "It was," I said, "and it was beautiful. But it is my home now, and you have to find a new one, both of you. You have to let go, and you have to let me go too." I was not just speaking to a ghost. I was speaking to my own grief. I was giving myself the permission I had never been able to find, the permission to move on. The silence stretched for a long, eternal moment, and then my phone, which was in my pocket, buzzed one last time. I pulled it out. A new message from Clara. It was not a picture. It was not a demand. It was a single, beautiful, and heartbreaking line of text. Tell him I would have named him Samuel. And then the name on the top of the screen, Clara, vanished. The number became just a number again, an unknown and now unreachable string of digits. I looked through the peephole. The porch was empty. The street was quiet. She was gone. I stood there, leaning my forehead against the cool wood of the door, and I wept. I wept for my wife. I wept for the son I had never known, and I wept for myself, for the 3 years I had spent living in a museum, when I should have been living in the world. The next day I began to pack. I took down the pictures. I boxed up her clothes. I threw away the half-finished novel and the ridiculously oversized coffee mug. They were not her. They were just things. The real memory of her, the one that mattered, the one that was full of love and laughter and a future that had almost been, was the one I would carry with me in my heart. I sold the house. I moved to a new city, a new life. I am a different man now. I am a man who has had a conversation with a ghost through a door and through a phone. I am a man who has learned that the dead do not want to be haunted. They just want to be remembered, and then they want to be let go. I am a man who had a son for a few brief and beautiful moments, a son whose name was Samuel. And it is a good name. It is a strong name. It is the name of a man who has survived. It is my name. The house was a gift from a ghost. Not a literal one, of course, but the ghost of a life I was supposed to have lived. It had been bought by my husband Michael, a man who had loved the solid, tangible things of the world, the heft of an old book, the grain of reclaimed timber, the satisfying click of a well-made lock. He had bought it 3 weeks before a slick of black ice on a mountain road had turned our shared future into a singular, desolate present. He had seen the house, an old forgotten Victorian dowager on a cliff overlooking the sea, and had declared it the place where we would grow old, a beautiful, sprawling repository for our future memories. I, a forensic sketch artist, a man who made his living by giving faces to the faceless, was left to inherit a future I no longer had a partner for. My name is Elias Vance. For the first 6 months after the funeral, I couldn't bring myself to even visit the house. It sat empty, a monument to a future that had been canceled. But the lease on my city apartment was ending, and the thought of finding a new sterile space, a place untouched by Michael's memory, was somehow more painful than confronting the one he had chosen for us. So I packed my life into a series of sad brown cardboard boxes and moved to the ghost house. It was beautiful in a sad, neglected way. The salt-laced wind had scoured the paint from the cedar shingles, leaving the wood a soft, silvery gray. The rooms were large and airy, with high ceilings and tall, multi-paned windows that were perpetually fogged with a thin, greasy layer of sea mist. The house was a project, and I, a man with nothing but time and a grief so profound it felt like a full-time job, needed a project. The face appeared in the plaster. It was in the master bedroom, a vast, cold room on the second floor with a panoramic view of the churning gray Atlantic. A leak in the roof, probably decades old, had left a sprawling, complex water stain on the wall opposite the bed. It was a chaotic, organic map of brown and yellow continents on a sea of peeling ecru-colored paint. And in the heart of that map, I began to see it. At first, it was just pareidolia, the mind's desperate innate need to find patterns in chaos. As a forensic artist, I was more susceptible to it than most. My brain was professionally trained to see the ghost of a face in the vaguest of shapes, to find a hint of a jawline in a shadow, the suggestion of an eye socket in a blur. I would lie in bed in the profound, oceanic silence of the house, and I would watch the shifting light of the moon play across the stain, and I would see the face. It was a man's face, gaunt and long, with high cheekbones and deep-set eyes. It was a face from a forgotten photograph, a tin-type ghost. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a symptom of a mind that was raw and tired and lonely. I decided to paint the room, to exorcise the stain and its phantom inhabitant with a clean, sterile coat of decorator's white. I spent a full day prepping the walls, scraping away the peeling paint, patching the cracks. The old plaster was a strange, fibrous, and almost organic thing, mixed with what looked like horsehair, a common building material from the era. As I worked, I felt a strange, almost imperceptible coolness emanating from the stained section of the wall, a pocket of cellar-cold air in the otherwise mild room. The next day, I applied the first coat of paint. The thick white primer covered the stain completely, leaving a blank, uniform, and blessedly featureless surface. I felt a sense of profound, almost cleansing relief. I had erased the ghost. I had imposed order on the chaos. That night, I slept more soundly than I had in months, but when I woke up in the gray pre-dawn light, I saw that the stain had returned. It had bled through the fresh, thick coat of primer a faint, brownish watermark that was impossibly more detailed, more defined than before. And the face was no longer a vague suggestion. It was a portrait. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart a frantic, trapped bird against my ribs. The features were clear now. The long, straight nose, the thin, unsmiling lips, the hollows of the cheeks, and the eyes. The eyes were the most terrifying part. They were just two dark, almond-shaped smudges, but they were looking directly at me. They were not the blank, empty eyes of a painting. They were the focused, intelligent, and deeply, profoundly, anciently sad eyes of a conscious observer. My rational mind, a sputtering, dying engine, tried to offer up a scientific explanation, a chemical reaction. The specific mineral content of the water in the plaster reacting with the latex in the paint. It was a plausible, if unlikely, theory. But it did not explain the eyes. It did not explain the chilling and deeply personal feeling of being watched. I refused to be driven from my own bedroom. I was a man of science, of logic. I was a man who drew lines, who defined the world in shades of graphite and charcoal. This was just a problem of chemistry and perception. But the face continued to evolve. Each morning it was a little clearer, a little more detailed. The faint suggestion of an earlobe appeared. The subtle, incised line of a wrinkle at the corner of an eye. It was as if a photograph was slowly, agonizingly developing in the very substance of my wall. My professional curiosity, a thing I had thought long dead, began to stir, a morbid and perhaps self-destructive counterpoint to my growing terror. I began to sketch it. I would sit on a stool at the foot of my bed, my large leather-bound sketchbook in my lap, and I would draw the face in the wall. It was a strange and deeply unsettling reversal of my usual work. I was not drawing a face from the fragmented, emotional memories of a traumatized victim. I was drawing a face that was itself a memory, trapped in the plaster of my home. The act of drawing it was an act of intimacy. I came to know its every contour, its every subtle, melancholic detail. It was a handsome face in a severe, old-world way, a face that had known suffering. As I drew, the cool spot on the wall seemed to grow, to push out into the room, a palpable, invisible column of frigid air. My nights became a ritual of surveillance. I would lie in bed, my eyes fixed on the face, which was now so clear it was like looking at a faded, sepia-toned photograph. And I began to notice a new and infinitely more terrifying phenomenon. It was changing, not its features, but its expression. One night, the thin, straight line of its lips seemed to curve just slightly at the corners into a faint and deeply unsettling smile. Another night, the dark, smudged eyes seemed to widen just for a fraction of a second, as if in surprise. I was not just observing a static image. I was interacting with a responsive and sentient entity. I had to know who he was. My investigation became an obsession, a frantic, desperate dive into the history of the house, of the land it was built on. I spent my days in the dusty, silent archives of the local historical society, a man haunted not just by a ghost, but by a need for a name. The house had been built in 1888 by a man named Dr. Alastair Finch. The name sent a jolt of recognition through me. Finch. There was a wing at the city's main teaching hospital named after him. He was a pioneering anatomist, a brilliant and notoriously reclusive figure from the city's early history. He had built the house as a private retreat, a place to conduct his research far from the prying eyes of the academic world. The records were sparse. He had lived in a house alone, save for a single, taciturn housekeeper. He had no wife, no children. He was known for his obsessive, and some said morbid, dedication to his work. And then, in the winter of 1903, he had simply vanished. The housekeeper had arrived one morning to find the house empty. The doors were locked from the inside. Nothing was out of place. Dr. Finch's coat was on its hook, his half-finished breakfast on the table. He was just gone. The police had searched for months. They had dragged the sea. They had scoured the woods. They had found nothing. Alistair Finch had, for all intents and purposes, ceased to exist. I found a single, grainy photograph of him in an old medical journal. I held the journal in my trembling hands, my breath catching in my throat. It was him. The same long, gaunt face, the same high cheekbones, the same deep-set, sad, and intelligent eyes. The face in my wall was the face of Dr. Alistair Finch, a man who had disappeared from this very house over a century ago. The rational scientific explanations were now a distant, laughable memory. I was living in a haunted house, but it was not a ghost in the traditional sense. It was not the spirit of a dead man. It was the spirit of a man who had never been found, a man who was perhaps not dead at all, a man who was somewhere else, somewhere inside my walls. My great-uncle Henry's journals from the previous story about the mirror came to mind. Not ghosts, but echoes. My research into Dr. Finch led me down a darker, more esoteric path. He had not just been an anatomist. His later work, which had been dismissed by the medical community as the ravings of an eccentric, had been focused on what he called cellular memory. He believed that the human body was not just a machine of flesh and blood, but a vessel for a kind of energetic residue. He believed that a powerful, focused consciousness could, at the moment of extreme duress or concentration, leave an imprint of itself on its surrounding environment, an echo, a psychic photograph, and I found his formula. In a letter to a colleague, a letter in which he was clearly trying to secure funding for his increasingly strange research, he had described a new experimental plaster he had developed, a plaster that was not mixed with horsehair and sand, but with a fine, powdered, and deeply unsettling mixture of human bone ash and silver nitrate. He claimed it was the perfect medium, a kind of psychic film, capable of capturing the final, desperate, energetic imprint of a human soul. I felt a wave of nausea so profound I had to sit down. My walls were not just walls. They were a tomb, a recording medium. And the face of Dr. Finch was not a stain. It was a photograph, taken from the inside. He had not vanished. He had imprinted himself. He had become a part of the house. The phenomena began to escalate, to bleed out from the wall and into the room itself. I would hear a soft, dry, whispering sound at night, like the sound of a page being turned in an old, brittle book. I would wake up to find the objects on my bedside table rearranged, my sketchbook moved to the other side of the room. One morning, I found a single, perfect, and deeply disturbing handprint in the thick layer of dust on the floorboards in front of the wall. It was a long, slender hand, the hand of an academic, a surgeon, and it was as if someone had pressed their hand to the floor from the inside of the wall and the dust had settled around it. He was no longer just watching me, he was trying to reach me, and then the face began to change in a new and far more terrifying way. It began to look like me, It was a slow, subtle, and horrifying transformation. The line of the jaw would soften just slightly to match my own. The shape of the eyes would change, becoming a little wider, a little less deep-set. The thin, straight lips would become a little fuller. It was as if he was studying me, my own face, my own features, and he was incorporating them. He was using my own reflection, my own presence as a model, a template. He was overriding his own faded image with my fresh, living one. I was no longer just an observer of this phenomenon. I was a participant. I was the source material. He was not just a ghost in my house. He was a parasite, and he was feeding on my own identity. I had to get out. The thought was a primal, screaming imperative. I packed a bag, my hands shaking, my eyes darting nervously towards the wall, where the face, now a grotesque, androgynous fusion of my own features and his, watched me with a calm and deeply unsettling curiosity. I went to the front door, my hand on the knob, and the door would not open. The old, heavy and well-made lock was frozen solid. I tried the back door. The same. The windows, the old sash-cord windows that had been painted shut for decades, were now as solid and immovable as the stone foundation of the house itself. I was trapped. The house, his body, would not let me leave. I was a prisoner in a house that was actively and intelligently trying to consume me. My last desperate hope was my sister, Sarah. She was a journalist, a hard-headed, cynical, and deeply practical woman who had always viewed my artistic temperament with a kind of affectionate pity. She was the only person I had told about the house, and she had, of course, assumed my strange behavior was just an eccentric and slightly morbid manifestation of my grief. She had promised to drive up from the city at the end of the week to check on me. I had my phone. I had a signal. I called her. My voice was a frantic, terrified mess. I told her I was trapped. I told her the house wouldn't let me out. She was silent on the other end of the line for a long moment. I could hear the deep, weary sigh of a woman who was convinced her brother had finally and completely lost his mind. "Okay, Elias," she said, her voice the calm, placating tone one uses with a frightened child or a lunatic. "Okay, I'm on my way. I'll leave right now. It will take me about 3 hours. Just try to stay calm. Can you do that for me?" 3 hours. It felt like a lifetime. I spent those 3 hours in a state of high-alert, paranoid terror. I barricaded myself in the living room, as far away from the bedroom, from the wall, as I could get. The whispering was louder now, a constant, sibilant, and almost conversational murmur that was coming from all the walls at once. And in the whispering, I could hear my own name, Elias. And then the wall in the living room, the one that faced the sea, the one where Michael and I had planned to hang his favorite oversized abstract painting, began to change. The plaster began to ripple, to soften, as if it were turning from a solid to a liquid. And a new face began to emerge, a face I knew as well as my own, the face of my dead husband, Michael. It was a perfect, heartbreakingly perfect rendition of him. But his eyes were wrong. They were the same, dark, sad, and intelligent eyes as the face in the bedroom wall. It was him. It was Finch, and he was wearing Michael's face like a mask. "Don't you miss him, Elias?" the wall seemed to whisper. The voice a grotesque and deeply insulting imitation of Michael's own deep and gentle baritone. "It's so lonely here. We could be together, all three of us. The monster was not just trying to steal my face, it was trying to steal my grief. It was using my own most profound and deeply personal pain as a weapon against me. It was the ultimate violation. I screamed, a raw, ragged, and utterly hopeless sound of pure animal rage and despair. I picked up a heavy iron fire poker and I swung it at the wall, at the perfect, beautiful, and monstrous face of my dead husband. The poker hit the wall with a dull, wet, and sickening thud, as if I had struck a side of beef. The plaster did not crack. It bruised. A dark, ugly, purplish mark appeared, and the face of Michael contorted, not in pain, but in a slow and deeply, deeply satisfied smile. It was feeding on it. My rage, my despair, my violent and desperate and futile and grief-stricken and love-filled action, they were its food. My emotional energy was the very thing that was allowing it to break through, to become more real, more solid. I dropped the poker, my body going limp with the sudden, horrifying realization I could not fight it. Fighting it only made it stronger. I was in a cage with a monster, and the monster was feeding on my own desperate attempts to escape. I heard the sound of a car on the gravel driveway. Sarah, she was here. I ran to the window. Her small, sensible sedan was parked outside. She was getting out, her face a mask of worried determination. I banged on the window, but the sound was a dull, muted thud. The house was soundproofed from the inside now, too. She couldn't hear me. She went to the front door and knocked. I heard the sound, faint and distant. She tried the knob. It was locked. She called my name. I screamed it back, but my voice was a dead, flat thing in the silent, waiting air of the house. And then I saw it. The plaster on the wall by the front door, the wall right next to where she was standing, began to ripple. A new face was beginning to form, a woman's face, her face. It was going to take her, too. It was going to surround me with the faces of everyone I had ever loved, a living, breathing, and eternal mausoleum of my own personal history. I was not just going to be its prisoner. I was going to be the curator of my own private hell. In that moment of absolute and final despair, a strange, cold clarity washed over me. I thought of my work, of the faces I drew. I was a man who brought form to the formless, who created order from the chaos of memory. And this house, this entity, was doing the same thing. It was an artist, a monstrous and deeply and profoundly lonely artist, and its medium was me. I could not fight it. I could not run from it. So I had to do the one thing it would not expect. I had to create a piece of art that it could not comprehend. I had to create a new face. I ran back to my studio, the one room in a house that had, so far, remained untouched. I grabbed my sketchbook, my charcoal, my graphite. I sat on the floor, in the center of the living room, my back to the monstrous emerging face of my sister, and I began to draw. I did not draw a face of sadness or of fear or of rage. I did not draw a face from my past. I drew a face from a future that I was now, in this last desperate act, trying to create. I drew a face of pure, unadulterated, and utterly irrational joy. I drew a man laughing, his head thrown back, his eyes crinkling at the corners, his mouth open in a wide, beautiful, and unrestrained shout of pure, unbridled happiness. I poured every last remaining ounce of my own depleted life force, of my own desperate hope for a future that was not this, into the drawing. I drew a face that had no place in this house of sorrow. I drew a face that was a lie. A beautiful, powerful, and defiant lie. The whispering in the walls faltered. The rippling of the plaster on the wall behind me slowed and then stopped. The house, the entity, was confused. This was an emotion it did not understand. Joy was a language it did not speak. My grief, my fear, my rage, that was its food, its building material. This was poison. I kept drawing, my hands a frantic, desperate blur. I was not just drawing a picture. I was performing an exorcism. I was fighting a monster not with iron and salt, but with charcoal and hope. The face of Michael on the far wall began to fade, to recede back into the plaster, its perfect, sad features contorting in a look of profound and deep and utter confusion. The house began to groan, a low, structural, and deeply wounded sound. The cold in the air began to recede. I finished the drawing. I held it up. It was the best thing I had ever created. It was a face of pure, impossible, and defiant life. And I taped it to the wall, directly over the spot where the face of my sister had begun to form. "This is my house now," I whispered, my voice a raw and shaky and finally, blessedly, hopeful thing. "And this is the only face you're allowed to have." The house let out a long, shuddering, and deeply mournful sigh, a sound that was not of a monster, but of a lonely and finally defeated thing. And then it was silent. The lock on the front door clicked open. I stumbled to the door and threw it open. Sarah was there, her hand raised to knock again, her face pale with worry. She looked at me, at the wild and ragged and charcoal-smeared and finally, truly and deeply and beautifully alive man that I had become. "Elias," she whispered, "are you okay?" I looked at her, and for the first time in a very, very long time, I smiled. A real smile, a true smile, a smile that was not a memory or a ghost or a lie. It was just a smile. "Yeah," I said, my voice a quiet and steady and finally peaceful thing. "Yeah, I think I am. My GPS keeps directing me to the same abandoned house. The voice in my car is a woman named Cal. I don't know if that's her real name or even if she's a real woman. She speaks with the placid, uninflected calm of someone who has never been late, never been lost, and never felt the cold, creeping dread of being somewhere you are not supposed to be. Cal is the default voice of the Wayfinder 5000, a slightly outdated but relentlessly reliable GPS unit, suction-cupped to my windshield. For the past 6 years, as a regional sales manager for a mid-level pharmaceutical company, Cal has been my co-pilot, my navigator, my silent synthetic companion on the lonely asphalt veins of the American Midwest. She has never been wrong until she started trying to kill me, or if not kill me, then something far, far worse. The first time it happened, I was on my way to a meeting in rural Wisconsin. I was cutting through a stretch of farmland so flat and featureless, it felt like a screensaver. My appointment was in a town called Prairie Ridge, a place that barely registered as a smudge on the map. According to Cal, I was 40 minutes away. "In 200 feet, turn left," she said, her voice as serene as a mountain lake. I glanced at the screen. The purple line of my route took a sharp, 90-degree turn off the main highway and onto a thin gray line that the map didn't even bother to name. "Recalculating," I said aloud, a habit I'd picked up over thousands of miles of solo driving. I tapped the screen, looking for an alternate route. There was none. This was it. I slowed the car and made the turn. The road was gravel, loose and chattering under my tires. Overgrown cornfields pressed in on both sides, their dry stalks rustling with a sound like whispering snakes. After about a mile, the road degraded further, becoming little more than two dirt tracks with a spine of weeds growing down the middle. My sensible company-issued sedan was not built for this. "Are you sure about this, Cal?" I muttered. "In 1,000 feet, your destination will be on the right," she replied, oblivious to my concern. The cornfields fell away, and the trees began, ancient skeletal oaks that formed a dark, claustrophobic canopy over the road. And then I saw it. Set back from the road, half swallowed by a sea of thorny, overgrown bushes, was a house. It was an old farmhouse, the kind that might have been charming a century ago. Now it was a study in decay. The white paint had peeled away in long, leprous strips, revealing the gray, weathered wood beneath. The windows were dark, hollow eyes, most of them boarded up with mismatched planks. A single skeletal tree stood in the front yard, its dead branches reaching for the sky like the fingers of a drowning man. The place didn't just feel abandoned, it felt condemned, cursed. A deep, instinctual wrongness emanated from it, a silence that was heavier and more profound than the surrounding woods. "You have arrived at your destination," Cal announced cheerfully. I stopped the car, the engine a loud, intrusive rumble in the oppressive quiet. This was not Prairie Ridge. This was the middle of nowhere. A mapping error, a glitch in the satellite. I felt a surge of annoyance, mixed with a strange, inexplicable prickle of fear. I didn't get out of the car. I didn't want to breathe the air here. I just wanted to leave. I put the car in reverse and began the slow, careful process of backing down the narrow, rutted track. My eyes kept darting to the house in my rearview mirror. I could have sworn I saw a flicker of movement in one of the dark upstairs windows, like a curtain being drawn aside. But there were no curtains. There was only splintered wood and darkness. By the time I got back to the highway and re-entered Prairie Ridge as my destination, I was an hour late for my meeting. I managed to salvage the sale with a flurry of apologies and a steep discount. I blamed the GPS, laughing it off as a piece of junk technology. But the image of that house was burned into my mind. The dead tree, the boarded-up windows, the feeling of being watched by something old and malevolent. 2 weeks later, I was in eastern Ohio, on my way to a conference, a different state, a different highway, hundreds of miles away. I was making good time, listening to a podcast, my mind on the quarterly report I had to file. "In 1/4 mile, take the exit on your right," Cal said. I glanced at the screen. The exit was for a state route that seemed to veer off into a large, green, unpopulated area on the map. My route should have kept me on the interstate for another 50 miles. "No, Cal," I said, sighing. "We're staying on the highway." I drove past the exit. Cal was silent for a moment. Then, "Recalculating. In 200 feet, turn left." She was trying to take me onto a small local road, a road that, according to the map, led nowhere. A cold, familiar dread began to bloom in my stomach. "Recalculate to avoid back roads," I said, my voice sharp. "Route recalculated," she replied. "In 1,000 feet, perform a U-turn where possible." For the next 10 minutes, we were locked in a battle of wills. Every route she suggested was a circuitous, nonsensical path that tried to steer me off the main road and into the rural unknown. She was like a horse that refused to be led, stubbornly trying to bolt for some unseen, familiar stable. Finally, in a fit of frustration, I unplugged the Wayfinder 5000 and threw it onto the passenger seat. I used my phone's mapping app for the rest of the trip. As I lay in my sterile, anonymous hotel room that night, I couldn't sleep. I picked up the Wayfinder and plugged it back in. The screen flickered to life. The map showed my current location, a little blue dot in the heart of the city. I opened the recent destinations list. At the very top of the list, it read, Crows End Road. I'd never heard the name before. I typed it into my phone's search engine. There were a few scattered results, none of them in Ohio, but one of them, a hit from a county plat map website, was in Wisconsin. It was an unmaintained dead-end road. My blood ran cold. It was the road to the abandoned house. The GPS hadn't just made a mistake. It had saved the location. It wanted to go back. The incidents grew more frequent and more insidious. Cal would be silent for hours, lulling me into a false sense of security. And then, at a crucial intersection, she would give a last-second incorrect instruction, trying to divert me. It became a constant low-level war. I began to hate the sound of her calm, pleasant voice. It was the voice of a saboteur, a traitor, in my own car. I bought a new GPS, a top-of-the-line model from a different brand. I boxed up the Wayfinder 5000 and put it in the trunk. I felt a sense of liberation as I programmed my first trip into the new device. The new voice was a man with a crisp British accent. It was a refreshing change. I was driving through Indiana on my way to see a client in Fort Wayne. The new GPS was working perfectly. In 1 mile, you will reach your destination, the British voice announced. And then a burst of static from the car's speakers. The new GPS screen flickered and went blank. A moment later, it came back on. But the map was different. It was a local, rural map. The British voice was gone. In 200 feet, turn left, said the calm, familiar, horrifying voice of Cal. I stared at the screen in disbelief. It was Cal's interface, her purple line, her familiar fonts. She had somehow overridden the new device. She had infected it. My car, my sanctuary, the one place where I was supposed to be in control, had been completely and utterly compromised. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands shaking. This was not a glitch. This was not a technological error. This was something else. This was an intelligence, a malevolent, focused intelligence that was fixated on one thing, getting me back to that house. That was when my life began to unravel. The fight was no longer just about directions. It was about my sanity. I became obsessed. I spent my nights in hotel rooms, not preparing for meetings, but scouring the internet, digging into the history of that small, forgotten plot of land in rural Wisconsin. The property on Crow's End Road, I discovered, had belonged to a family named the Whitakers. The last record of them was from a census of 1978. A husband, Silas, a wife, Mary, and a 6-year-old daughter named Lily. Then, in the fall of that same year, there was a fire. The official report, which I found in a digitized archive of the local newspaper, was brief and tragic. The fire had consumed the house. The cause was listed as undetermined. The bodies of Silas and Mary were found in the ashes. The daughter, Lily, was never found. She was presumed to have perished in the blaze, her small body consumed by the inferno. The article ended with a haunting single line from the fire chief at the time. "It's a terrible tragedy. That house is at the end of a long, dark road. By the time we got the call and found our way out there, it was too late. There was nothing we could do." I stared at the grainy black and white photo that accompanied the article. It was the house. My house. But it was before the decay had set in, before the boards were on the windows. It was just an ordinary, slightly ramshackle farmhouse, and on the porch, so small and out of focus that she was almost a ghost, was a little girl in a white dress holding a doll, Lily. The knowledge didn't bring me peace. It brought a deeper, colder dread. The house wasn't just an abandoned building. It was a tomb, a place of profound, unresolved tragedy. And for some reason, its ghost had latched onto my GPS. The haunting escalated. Cal began to speak to me even when the GPS was turned off. I'd be driving in silence, and her voice would suddenly emanate from the car's speakers, soft and clear. "Are you lost, Alan?" she'd ask. My name is Alan. I had never programmed my name into the device. The first time it happened, I almost drove off the road. I tore the GPS from the windshield, unplugged it, and threw it in the trunk, burying it under a suitcase. But her voice still came through the speakers. She was in the car's Bluetooth system, in its very wiring. She began to use details from my life. "Sarah is wondering when you will be home," she said one night as I was driving through a rainstorm. Sarah was my wife. "Emily has a piano recital on Friday. You shouldn't miss it." Emily was my 7-year-old daughter. The voice was using my own life, my love for my family, as a weapon against me, a way to anchor my fear, to make it more real. My work suffered. I missed meetings. I lost clients. I was constantly exhausted, living on a knife's edge of paranoia and fear. My boss put me on probation. I tried to explain, but how do you tell your boss that your car is haunted by a ghost who is obsessed with a tragic fire from the 1970s? My home life, my sanctuary, began to crumble. Sarah knew something was wrong. I was distant, jumpy, prone to long, silent stares out the window. I had lost weight. I had dark, bruised-looking circles under my eyes. "Alan, what is it?" she asked one night, her voice full of a worry that was beginning to curdle into frustration. "You're like a ghost. You're here, but you're not. Are you having an affair?" The question was so mundane, so normal, it was almost a relief. "No," I said, the word coming out as a choked, hollow sound. "God, no, it's the driving. I'm just burned out." It was a weak, pathetic lie, and we both knew it. The distance between us grew. A cold, silent canyon, carved out by a secret I couldn't share. How could I tell her that I was terrified to get in my car? That I had started taking rental cars to my meetings, only to have Cal's voice eventually bleed through their speakers, too. She was not tied to the device. She was tied to me. The dream started. I would be in the house. It was no longer abandoned, but filled with a thick, acrid smoke that stung my eyes and choked my lungs. I could hear a child crying, a thin, terrified wail that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I would try to find her, stumbling through the smoke-filled rooms, my hands outstretched, but the layout of the house would shift and change, a maddening architectural nightmare. I would always wake up just as I reached the door to the nursery, my hand on the hot brass knob, the sound of the girls weeping on the other side. I knew I was approaching a breaking point. I was losing my job, my wife, my mind. I was a man being haunted into oblivion. I had two choices. I could let it destroy me, or I could confront it. I had to go back to the house. I had to go to Crow's End Road, not as a lost, accidental tourist, but as a man looking for an answer. I had to understand why this was happening to me, why I had been chosen. I told Sarah I was going on a weekend sales retreat. Another lie to add to the growing pile. I got in my car. This time, I didn't fight it. I plugged in the Wayfinder 5000. Its screen cracked from one of my more violent attempts to silence it. "Navigate to last destination," I said, my voice a resigned, trembling whisper. "Navigating to Crow's End Road," Cal replied, her voice sounding for the very first time something like satisfied. The drive was 5 hours. Cal was silent the entire way, a quiet, expectant presence. As I turned off the highway and onto the familiar gravel road, a thick, unnatural fog rolled in, blanketing the cornfields in a shroud of gray. The world grew silent, my car the only moving thing in a dead, quiet landscape. When I arrived, the house looked different. The decay was the same, but the wrongness I had felt before was now a palpable, physical presence. It was a low, humming vibration in the air, a pressure against my eardrums. It was the feeling of a place that was awake and waiting. I got out of the car. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth and something else. Smoke. A faint, phantom smell of old, cold smoke. I walked up the rotten, sagging steps of the porch. The front door was ajar, hanging from a single rusted hinge. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was a wreck. Dust as thick and soft as gray snow covered everything. The furniture was draped in cobwebs that looked like funeral shrouds. In the center of the living room, there was a large, dark stain on the floorboards where the fire had burned hottest. My eyes were drawn to the staircase. It led up into a darkness that felt solid, absolute. The child's weeping from my dreams echoed in my memory. "Why am I here?" I shouted, my voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. "Are you lost, Alan?" The voice wasn't Cal's. It was in my head. A man's voice, rough and low, like stones grinding together. I spun around. The room was empty. "You're not supposed to be here," the voice whispered in my mind. "This is my house. She is my daughter." A cold, creeping terror, far worse than anything I had felt before, began to seep into my bones. This was not the ghost of a lost little girl. This was something else. This was Silas, the father. I stumbled back, my hand finding the wall to steady myself. My fingers brushed against a patch of peeling wallpaper. Underneath it was a dark, almost black wood. The house had been charred from the inside out. The fire had been far worse than the newspaper had reported. I forced myself to move, to explore. I was an archaeologist in a tomb of sorrow. I found a kitchen, a rusted-out stove, a table with a single overturned chair. I found the master bedroom, a mattress with its springs bursting out like broken ribs. And then I found the nursery. The door was closed. The brass knob was cool to the touch. I took a deep breath and pushed it open. The room was almost completely burned out. The walls were black with soot. The crib was a skeletal, charred frame. The air was thick with the smell of tragedy. But in the corner of the room, something had survived. It was a small wooden toy chest. The paint had been blistered by the heat, but it was largely intact. I knelt down and opened it. Inside, nestled among a few melted plastic toys, was a single leather-bound diary, its pages yellowed and warped by the heat and the damp. The name Mary Whitaker was embossed on the cover. I opened it, my hands trembling. Mary's handwriting was a neat, elegant script, but as the entries progressed, they became a frantic, terrified scrawl. She wrote of her husband, Silas, of a good man who had been consumed by a darkness, a possessive, jealous rage. She wrote of his obsession with his daughter, Lily, an obsession that had soured into something unnatural, something terrifying. He wouldn't let her go to school. He wouldn't let her have friends. He saw every stranger as a threat. The final entry was dated the night of the fire. He has locked us in. He says the world is too full of poison, that he is the only one who can keep Lily pure. He has been talking to himself all day. I can smell gasoline. He is not going to let us leave. He is going to keep us here with him forever. If anyone ever finds this, know that I tried to save my daughter. Know that I loved her. A single hot tear dripped onto the fragile page. It wasn't a tragic accident. It was a murder-suicide. Silas had been a monster. He had trapped his family, and when he couldn't control them in life, he had bound them to this place in death. But that didn't explain me. It didn't explain the GPS. I heard a floorboard creak behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Nothing but the feeling of being watched, of Silas's malevolent presence, was suffocating. I had to get out. I stumbled out of the nursery, clutching the diary, and ran for the stairs. As I reached the bottom step, I saw it. On a small, dusty table by the front door, half hidden under a pile of rotted mail, was an object that had no business being there. It was a Wayfinder 5000 GPS unit, the exact same model as mine. Its screen was cracked, and it was caked in dust and grime, but it was unmistakable. And then the final, horrifying piece of the puzzle clicked into place. My GPS wasn't haunted by a ghost from the house. My GPS was from the house. Silas Whitaker, a traveling salesman, perhaps, like me. A man who relied on a piece of technology to guide him. A man who had programmed his home address into the device. A single, final destination. On that last, terrible night, as he drove home with his can of gasoline and his murderous intent, that GPS had been in his car, charting his final fatal course. The device had absorbed the trauma, the rage, the violent possessive energy of that night. It had become a vessel for his will. It was a cursed object, a relic of a murder. And somehow, through the strange, convoluted currents of second-hand sales and forgotten electronics, it had found its way to me. Or, more terrifyingly, it had chosen me. A man just like him, a traveling father with a wife and a daughter at home. It was trying to repeat the pattern. It was trying to bring me home, to its home, to make me a part of its endless tragic loop. You can stay, the voice of Silas whispered in my head. We can be a family. I heard the front door slam shut with a deafening final boom. The air grew cold. The shadows in the room deepened and seemed to coalesce. A figure began to form in the doorway, a tall, gaunt man made of smoke and rage and decades of festering hate. But another presence was in the room now, too, a small, cold spot by the foot of the stairs. I could hear a faint, sobbing sound. It was her, Lily. She wasn't a part of his rage. She was his victim, his prisoner. And she was just as trapped as he was. I knew then what I had to do. I couldn't fight him. He was too strong here. This was his house. But maybe I could free her. The GPS. It was a beacon for him, but maybe it could be a key for her. It was a map. It knew the way home. but it was stuck on its final terrible instruction. I had to give it a new one. I ran back to my car, the ghost of Silas shrieking with rage behind me, the force of his anger a physical battering wind. I fumbled for my keys, my hands slick with sweat. I got in the car and slammed the door, locking it. The windows began to frost over from the inside. A child's small spectral handprint appeared on the passenger side glass. I ripped my own wayfinder from the dashboard. I looked at the little girl's handprint. "It's okay," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I'm going to take you home. Not this home, a different one." My fingers flew across the screen of the GPS. I went into the settings, into the saved addresses. Under Home, it listed the coordinates for Crow's End Road. I deleted it. Then I typed in a new address. My address. The address where my wife and daughter were waiting. The address that, for the past few months, I had been too terrified to even think about. "Set destination to home," I said, my voice firm. The screen flickered. The ghost of Silas roared, and the car shook violently, as if in the grip of a giant, unseen hand. For a moment, the map showed the twisted, impossible route back to the farmhouse. But then something shifted. A new, clean, purple line appeared on the screen, leading away from this place of horror, leading back towards the highway, back towards the world of the living. "Navigating to home," Cal said. Her voice was different. The cold, synthetic edge was gone. It was just a voice now, a tool. The curse had been broken. The pressure on the car vanished. The frost on the windows melted away. The small, spectral handprint faded. I looked in my rearview mirror. The house on Crow's End Road was just a house again, a sad, rotting structure in a dying wood. The profound, malevolent wrongness was gone. I had not defeated the ghost of Silas Whitaker. I had simply taken away his map. I had stolen his ride. I drove away from that place and didn't look back. The 5-hour drive home was the quietest, most peaceful drive of my life. I threw the Wayfinder 5000 into a gas station trash can 100 miles away. When I walked through my front door, the smell of Sarah's cooking, the sound of Emily practicing a clumsy, beautiful song on the piano, it was the most sacred, wonderful sensory experience of my life. I held them both, my face buried in their hair, and I wept. They didn't understand why, not really, and I would never be able to tell them. I quit my job. I found a new one, a local one. I don't drive much anymore. My world has become smaller and infinitely more precious. I am a man who has looked into the abyss, a place where love becomes a cage and home becomes a tomb. I am a man who was chosen by a ghost to be his replacement. But I refused the role. I rewrote the map. I chose my own destination, and every morning, when I wake up in my own bed next to my wife, with the sound of my daughter padding down the hall, I know, with a gratitude that is as deep and as real as a prayer, that I have arrived. I am home. I answered a phone call from my own number. The first time it happened, I dismissed it as a glitch, a harmless bit of digital flotsam in the ever-congested currents of modern communication. I was an architect, a man who believed in blueprints and solid foundations, a man whose life was built on the comforting certainty of physics and logic. Ghosts, hauntings, and paradoxes were the stuff of fiction, not the carefully ordered reality of my life with my fiancée Chloe. It was a Tuesday in October. Rain, gray and relentless, slicked the streets of the city, and I was running late. I was juggling a lukewarm coffee, a portfolio case that weighed a ton, and an umbrella that seemed to have a personal vendetta against my right eye. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. Fumbling, I managed to fish it out, expecting a call from my boss, a man whose patience was as thin as tracing paper. But the name on the screen wasn't his. It was my own. Daniel Reed. Beneath it was my number, the 10 digits I'd had since I was a teenager, as familiar to me as my own reflection. A spoofed number, I thought, some telemarketer in a distant country using a clever algorithm to get me to pick up. Annoyed, I swiped to answer, a sharp, "Who is this?" already on my lips. The voice that answered was my own. It wasn't just a similar voice, it was my voice, the exact same pitch, the same slight rasp from the coffee, the same cadence. It was like listening to a recording of myself, but a recording that was happening in real time. "Don't get on the 8:15 train," the voice said. It was calm, measured, but laced with an undercurrent of something I couldn't place. Urgency? Fear? I stood frozen on the crowded sidewalk, the rain dripping from my useless umbrella. The 8:15 was my train. I'd taken it every day for the past 5 years. "Who is this?" I repeated, my voice a half-strangled whisper. "There's going to be a power surge at the Fulton Street Junction. The train will be stuck in the tunnel for 3 hours. You'll miss the Henderson presentation." The voice was flat, matter-of-fact, as if reading a weather report. "Take the crosstown bus instead. You'll be late, but you'll make it." A cold, prickling sensation ran up my spine. The Henderson presentation was the biggest project of my career, the culmination of 6 months of sleepless nights and relentless work. Missing it would be catastrophic. This prank was too specific, too cruel. "Very funny," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Who is this? Mark? Is that you?" Mark was a colleague from work with a juvenile sense of humor. There was a pause on the other end, and for a moment I heard the faint, unmistakable sound of a ticking clock. It was the same sound as the old grandfather clock in my parents' hallway, a sound I hadn't heard in years. "Just take the bus, Daniel," the voice said, and then the line went dead. I stared at my phone, my heart hammering against my ribs. A prank. It had to be a prank, some new voice-mimicking software. But the specificity of it. Fulton Street Junction. 3 hours. It was just enough to make me hesitate. The 8:15 was pulling into the station, its doors hissing open. I looked at the train, then at the bus stop down the block. Logic warred with a primal, inexplicable fear. In the end, logic lost. I turned away from the station and walked towards the bus stop, feeling like a fool. An hour and a half later, I walked into my office, soaked and flustered, but just in time for the presentation. The office was in a state of controlled chaos. Mark rushed over to me, his face pale. "Man, you are the luckiest guy on the planet," he said. "Did you hear? The 8:15 is stuck in the tunnel between stations. Massive power surge at the Fulton Street Junction. They're saying it'll be at least another 2 hours before they can get them out." The blood drained from my face. I leaned against a cubicle wall, my portfolio case slipping from my numb fingers. It wasn't a prank. It was real. I had just received a warning from the future, from a version of myself who had somehow lived through the next 3 hours and called back in time to save me. The thought was so absurd, so completely outside the realm of my carefully constructed reality, that I almost laughed. But the fear that coiled in my gut was cold and hard and very, very real. The calls became a regular, if terrifying, feature of my life. They were never scheduled, always unexpected. A buzz from my pocket would reveal my own name on the screen, and the Daniel on the other end would deliver a terse, cryptic piece of advice. Don't order the salmon for lunch. You'll get food poisoning. Take a right on Elm Street. There's a pileup on the interstate. Chloe is going to call in 10 minutes, upset about her sister. Just listen. Each prediction, no matter how small or mundane, came true. The warnings were my own personal paradoxical guardian angel. I never told Chloe. How could I? She was a psychiatrist, a woman who dealt in the rational, the explainable. She would have had me committed, or at the very least, started looking at me with that gentle, clinical pity I couldn't bear. So I kept a secret, a strange, buzzing anxiety that lived just beneath the surface of my skin. I began to rely on the calls, to wait for them. My life, once a predictable series of my own choices, was now a reactive dance with a mysterious, omniscient partner. The tone of the calls began to change. The voice on the other end, my voice, started to sound different, more confident, colder. The helpful warnings began to be interspersed with more personal, more manipulative instructions. Don't go to your parents' anniversary dinner on Saturday, the voice said one afternoon. Why not? I asked. The question was a reflex. I had learned not to question, but this felt different. You'll have a fight with your father, a bad one. It will ruin the night. Just tell them you're sick. I followed the stale advice, calling my mother with a fake, rasping cough. She was disappointed, and I felt a pang of guilt. But the thought of avoiding the inevitable circular argument with my father about my career choices was a powerful sedative. Later that week, the voice told me not to go out for drinks with Mark and the guys from work. Mark is going to get too drunk and say something about Chloe's past that will upset you, it warned. I bailed, feigning a migraine. The voice was no longer just helping me avoid traffic jams and bad seafood. It was pruning my life. It was isolating me, cutting the threads that connected me to the people I cared about one by one. And the most terrifying part was that I was letting it. I was a willing participant in the dismantling of my own social life, all for the promise of a smoother, conflict-free existence. The first time I saw him, the other Daniel, was a hallucination, or so I told myself. I was at home, working late. Chloe was out with friends. My phone buzzed. It was my own number. She's not with her friends, the voice said, cold and sharp. She's meeting with her ex-boyfriend, Michael. She's been lying to you. A hot, ugly spike of jealousy and fear shot through me. It was a lie. Chloe wouldn't do that. But the voice had never been wrong. I hung up, my mind racing. I went to the window of my study, which overlooked the street, and peered out into the rainy darkness. Across the street, under the fuzzy orange glow of a street light, a man was standing. He was holding an umbrella, his face obscured by shadow, but he was wearing my coat. The dark gray trench coat I had left at the office, and he was looking right at my window. As I watched, he lifted a hand and waved, a slow, deliberate gesture. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the rain. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding. It was a stranger, a coincidence. My mind, frayed and paranoid from the stress of the calls, was playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just seen a ghost. my ghost. The next day, the true horror began. I got to work, and my key card wouldn't open the door. After a call to security, I finally got to my desk to find an email from HR informing me that my employment had been terminated due to gross misconduct and the unauthorized sharing of proprietary project data. I stared at the screen, my blood turning to ice. I hadn't shared anything. I would never. My boss called me into his office. He wouldn't look me in the eye. On his desk was a printout of an email chain between my work account and our biggest competitor. It contained blueprints, cost analyses, the entire Henderson project. The emails were written in my style, with my turns of phrase. They were undeniably from me, but I had never sent them. I was escorted from the building, my belongings in a cardboard box. My life, my career, had been annihilated in a single inexplicable act of digital sabotage. I drove home in a daze, my mind a screaming vortex of confusion and terror. The voice hadn't warned me about this. Why? When I got home, Chloe was there. She was sitting on the sofa, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed. She didn't look at me. "Chloe, you're not going to believe what happened," I started, the words tumbling out of me. "I know," she said, her voice a dead, flat thing. "You told me this morning." I stopped, my hand on the doorknob. "What are you talking about? I haven't spoken to you all day." She finally looked at me, and her expression was a mixture of fear and pity. "Daniel, stop it. You called me at 9. You were crying. You told me you'd been fired, that you'd made a terrible mistake. We talked for an hour. You said you were going to go for a drive to clear your head." I stared at her, the world tilting on its axis. "Chloe, that wasn't me." "Then who was it?" she cried, her voice breaking. "Who was it that knew that I was having doubts about us? Who brought up that stupid fight we had last year, the one we promised never to talk about again? Who apologized for being so distant and promised to be better?" She stood up, her hands clenched into fists. "It was you, Daniel, but the man standing in front of me now, you're not him. You look like him, but your eyes, they're terrified. The man I spoke to this morning was calm. He was relieved. He was taking over. The voice on the phone wasn't a future version of me. It was a copy, an echo, a parasite that had been systematically clearing a space for itself by destroying my life, isolating me from my friends and family, and now it was starting to move in. The warnings hadn't been to help me. They had been to build my trust, to make me compliant. The man in the trench coat hadn't been a hallucination. He was real, and he was stealing my life. I had to prove it. I had to prove I was the real Daniel. But how do you prove you are yourself when a perfect copy, one who knows all your secrets, is telling everyone you're not? I became a ghost in my own life. I couldn't go home. Chloe was afraid of me, and I was terrified that he would be there. I checked into a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, the kind that smells of stale cigarette smoke and desperation. I was running out of money, my bank account mysteriously frozen. He was thorough. My phone was my only link, my only weapon. The calls continued, but now they were taunts. "She misses you," the voice would say, and I could hear the smirk in it. "The old you, I mean, not the paranoid, erratic mess you've become. I'm taking her to that little Italian place you both love tonight. I'm going to be the man you were never good enough to be." I started my own investigation, fueled by caffeine and terror. I became a digital archaeologist, digging through the ruins of my own life. I searched for theories, for other cases, for anything that could explain what was happening. I found fragments, whispers in forgotten internet forums, and crackpot conspiracy sites. Stories of digital doppelgangers, of quantum echoes, of people whose lives had been hijacked by perfect, malevolent copies. Most of it was nonsense, but there was a recurring theme, a point of origin, a moment of intense trauma, a near-death experience, a place where reality had become thin and a person's identity had somehow been duplicated. My mind flashed back a year, a rain-slicked highway, the screech of tires, the blinding glare of headlights, a car accident that had left me with a broken leg and a concussion, but one which the doctors had said I was lucky to have survived. That was it. That had to be it. The moment I had almost died, a copy, a shadow of myself had been created, born from the trauma and the glitch in reality. This echo had been lying dormant, observing, learning, and now it was making its move. I knew I had to confront him, but a physical confrontation was useless. He looked like me. He sounded like me. He probably even bled like me. No, I had to expose him. I had to prove to the one person who mattered that he was a fraud. I had to get to Chloe. The plan was desperate, probably insane. The echo knew my memories, my secrets, but he didn't have my soul. He didn't have my capacity for genuine, spontaneous emotion. He was a recording, a perfect but lifeless imitation. I had to create a situation where that difference would become glaringly obvious. I called Chloe from a payphone. She answered, her voice wary. "Chloe, it's me," I said, my voice raw. "I don't know who this is anymore," she whispered. I know you're scared and confused, but I need you to listen to me. I can prove it. I can prove that the man you've been talking to is not me. Meet me tonight at the old observatory." The observatory was our place. It was where I had proposed to her on a clear summer night under a canopy of 1,000,000 stars. It was a place of deep, shared meaning, a place I hoped the echo wouldn't understand on an emotional level. "Why should I?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because a small part of you still knows it's me," I said, praying I was right. "Because you know the man you've been living with for the past week is off. A little too perfect, a little too calm. He's what I've always tried to be, but he's not what I am. 8 o'clock. Please, Chloe, my life depends on it." I hung up before she could refuse. Then I called my own number. The echo answered on the first ring. "Getting desperate, are we?" he said, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "It's over," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm meeting Chloe at the observatory at 8. I'm going to tell her everything." "You do that?" The echo laughed. "She'll think you've finally lost your mind completely. In fact, I think I'll come too. It will be fun to watch." It was exactly what I wanted. That night, the air was cold and sharp. The observatory stood on its hill like a silent white domed sentinel against the star-dusted sky. I got there early, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. Chloe arrived at 8 on the dot. She was wrapped in a thick coat, her face pale and drawn in the moonlight. She stood 10 feet away from me, her arms crossed, a wall of fear and distrust between us. "Daniel, this is crazy," she began. "Just listen," I pleaded. "He's coming. You're going to see us both." As if on cue, a figure emerged from the shadows of the parking lot. It was me. He was wearing my favorite leather jacket, his hair styled exactly like mine. He walked towards us with a confident, easy stride. He stopped beside Chloe and put a protective arm around her shoulder. She flinched, but didn't pull away. "See, honey," the echo said, his voice a perfect imitation of my own, full of gentle concern. "I told you he was unwell. He needs help." Chloe looked from him to me, her eyes wide with a terrifying, disbelieving comprehension. Seeing us both there, two identical men, was shattering her reality. "This is impossible," she breathed. "Now, Chloe," I said, my voice shaking, "I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to ask him the same question. It's the question you asked me right here, on this spot, the night I proposed." Her brow furrowed in confusion. "The question?" "You know the one," I urged, my eyes locked on hers, trying to pour every ounce of our shared history, our love, our genuine connection, into that single gaze. She turned to the echo. What was the question?" The echo smiled, a smooth, confident expression. "It's a trick, sweetheart. You never asked me a question. You were crying so hard you could barely speak. You just nodded and kissed me. It was a good guess, a logical one. It was what had happened on the surface, but it wasn't the truth." Chloe's eyes widened. She turned to me. "Daniel?" I took a deep breath. "You looked up at the moon and you asked me, if we build a life as beautiful as that, will we be afraid to live in it? And I told you, only if we live in it alone." Chloe let out a choked sob. It was a small, intimate, nonsensical detail, a fragment of a memory so personal it had never been spoken of again. A memory a perfect copy could never have, because it wasn't a memory of fact, but a memory of feeling. It was the emotional texture of our lives, something he couldn't access. The echo's smile faltered. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something other than confidence in his eyes. Confusion. And then rage. "It's a lucky guess," he snarled, his voice losing its perfect mimicry, becoming harsher, flatter. "He's been stalking us, listening to us." But the spell was broken. Chloe took a step away from him, towards me. "Get away from me," she whispered to the echo. The echo's face contorted, the mask of me slipping to reveal the monster beneath. "You can't have her. You can't have this life. It's mine. I earned it. I'm better than you. I'm the version of you without the anxiety, without the doubt, without the crippling fear of failure. I'm what you always wanted to be." "You're a ghost," I said, my own voice finding a strength I didn't know it possessed. "You're an echo of a bad memory. You're nothing." He lunged at me, his face a mask of fury. But he wasn't lunging at me in the physical world. I felt a sudden psychic pressure, a crushing assault on my mind. He was trying to invade my consciousness, to overwrite me. I saw flashes of the car crash, felt the phantom pain in my leg, the terror of the spinning metal. He was using my own trauma as a weapon against me. But I wasn't the same man who had been in that crash. The last few weeks had forged a new kind of resilience in me. I had been stripped of everything I thought defined me, my job, my home, my identity, and I was still standing. I pushed back, not with anger, but with acceptance. I accepted the fear. I accepted the doubt. I accepted the flawed, messy, imperfect reality of who I was. "You're right," I projected into his mind. "I am afraid. I am doubtful. That's what makes me real. You're just a copy, a perfect, empty copy." The echo screamed, a sound that was both in the air and inside my head. His physical form began to flicker, like a bad television signal. He was an entity built on a stolen identity, and now that his foundation had been proven false, he was coming apart. He wavered, his image stretching and distorting, his features melting like hot wax. He looked at me one last time, his eyes filled not with rage, but with a terrifying hollow emptiness. And then he dissolved, turning into a cloud of shimmering, static-like particles that were caught in the wind and scattered into the night. Silence. The only sound was Chloe's ragged breathing and the distant hum of the city. I stumbled forward, and she met me halfway, her arms wrapping around me in a desperate, clinging embrace. We just stood there for a long time, under the cold, silent watch of the stars, two survivors of an impossible storm. We rebuilt. It wasn't easy. The world doesn't have a protocol for dealing with a supernatural doppelganger who commits identity theft. I couldn't get my old job back, but I found a new one. We moved to a new apartment, trying to outrun the ghosts of our old life. The trust between Chloe and me, though shattered, was slowly, painstakingly being glued back together. We were scarred, but we were real. But I know he's not truly gone, not completely. He wasn't a creature I could kill. He was a possibility I had to disprove. He was a part of me, a dark potential, a shadow born from my own fear. I defeated him, but I can't destroy him. He's a latent file in the universe's hard drive, waiting, and so every time my phone rings with an unknown number, my heart seizes in my chest. Every time I see my own reflection in a dark window, I look for a flicker, a distortion. I live with the constant, quiet, terrifying knowledge that reality is a fragile thing, and that somewhere, in the static between the signals, a version of me is still out there, and he might just decide to call again. The sleep therapist who wouldn't let me wake up. My life had shrunk to the size of my bedroom and the hours between 2 and 5 a.m. For 2 years, sleep had been a country I was exiled from. I'd lie in the dark, my body a leaden weight of exhaustion, while my mind, a frantic caged bird, beat itself against the bars of my skull. When sleep did come, it was no relief. It was a plunge into a maelstrom of fragmented, terrifying nightmares. The sensation of falling from a building that never ended, the frantic search for a lost item I couldn't name, the chillingly calm presence of a figure in the corner of a room, its features always just out of focus. I'd wake up with my heart hammering, drenched in a cold sweat, more tired than when I'd gone to bed. I had tried everything: melatonin, chamomile tea, meditation apps that filled my head with the infuriatingly calm voice of a man telling me to observe my thoughts. I'd seen doctors who prescribed pills that either didn't work or left me in a fog for the entire next day. My job was suffering. My friendships had become strained, my patience worn down to a single frayed nerve. I was a ghost haunting the edges of my own life, and I was desperate. That's when I first heard the name Dr. Alistair Finch. It was mentioned in a hushed, reverent tone by a colleague who'd had a cousin suffering from debilitating sleep paralysis. "He cured her," she'd said, her eyes wide. "Completely. He doesn't use drugs. It's some kind of neuro-linguistic hypnotherapy. He calls it dream weaving." The name sounded like something from a fantasy novel, but I was long past skepticism. I would have consulted a shaman who wanted to sacrifice a goat in my living room if I thought it would grant me 8 hours of uninterrupted peace. Dr. Finch's clinic wasn't in a sterile medical building, but in a converted Victorian brownstone on a quiet, tree-lined street. The interior was a sanctuary of calm. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old books. There were no ticking clocks, only the gentle gurgle of a small fountain in the corner of the waiting room. Dr. Finch himself was the embodiment of this tranquility. He was an older man, perhaps in his late 60s, with a neatly trimmed silver beard, kind eyes magnified by wire-rimmed glasses, and a voice as soft and comforting as a weighted blanket. "Leo," he said, shaking my hand. His grip was firm and warm. "Thank you for coming. Insomnia is not a failure of will. It is a misalignment of narratives. Your waking mind and your sleeping mind are telling two different stories. My job is to help you make them agree on a plot." His confidence was hypnotic. In that first session, I poured out the whole miserable story of my last 2 years. He listened patiently, his head tilted, his gaze never leaving mine. He didn't take notes. He just listened. "Your subconscious is not your enemy, Leo," he explained when I had finished, my voice hoarse with emotion. "It is a frightened child, acting out in the only way it knows how. We are not going to silence it. We are going to teach it a new language. We are going to build it a safe place to live." His method, dream weaving, was unlike anything I'd experienced. It began with me reclining in the most comfortable leather chair I had ever sat in. The room was dimly lit, and through a set of high-end headphones, Dr. Finch would play a low, rhythmic hum, a binaural beat that seemed to vibrate deep inside my skull. Then his voice would begin, a gentle, melodic guide, walking me down a path of relaxation, limb by limb, thought by thought. The goal was to create what he called a lucid anchor, or a sanctum. It was a dream environment that I would build, detail by detail, in my waking mind, until it became so familiar that my subconscious would recognize it as a safe harbor. I chose a library, not just any library, but a specific one from my imagination. It had towering shelves of dark mahogany, a large crackling fireplace, and a vast domed ceiling that was a window to a calm, starry night sky. I chose the smell of old paper and leather, the weight of a specific velvet armchair, the taste of the warm tea in a ceramic mug I placed on a small table beside it. For the first few sessions, we just built. Dr. Finch's voice would guide me, asking the questions. "What kind of wood is the floor made from, Leo? Can you hear its gentle creak as you walk? What is the title of the book you're holding? Feel the texture of its cover." I was an architect of a world made of thought, and it worked. For the first time in years, I slept through the night. I didn't just sleep, I journeyed. I found myself in my library. It was exactly as I had imagined it, but infinitely more real. I could feel the warmth of the fire on my skin, run my fingers along the spines of 1,000 books. My night terrors were gone, replaced by a profound and restful peace. The change was miraculous. I woke up feeling refreshed, energized. The world seemed brighter, the colors more vivid. I was a new man. I told my friends, my family, my colleagues that Dr. Finch was a miracle worker. I was his most fervent evangelist. The therapy continued, and we went deeper. "Now that the foundation is built," Dr. Finch said, his voice humming through the headphones, "it is time to explore the rest of the castle." He encouraged me to open the doors of my library to see what my subconscious would create beyond it. The first time I did, I found a winding staircase that led up to an observatory where I could watch nebulae being born. Another door opened onto a sun-drenched beach, the waves lapping gently at the shore. My dream world was a paradise of my own making, and Dr. Finch was the key. It was about 2 months into the therapy that the first crack appeared in the perfect facade. Waking up started to become difficult. It wasn't the grogginess of sleeping pills. It was a deep, profound reluctance. The real world, with its deadlines and traffic and anxieties, felt so gray and dull compared to the vibrant, peaceful world I inhabited at night. Dr. Finch's session-ending countdown, his voice gently guiding me back to wakefulness, felt like an unwelcome intrusion. I started hitting the snooze button in the mornings, not for more sleep, but for a few more stolen moments in my dreamscape. Then came the first time I couldn't wake up on my own. It happened during a session. I was on my dream beach, watching the binary sun set over a turquoise ocean, when I realized the session must have been running long. I decided to try and wake myself up, a trick I'd learned from reading about lucid dreaming online. I tried to hold my nose and breathe, to push my finger through the palm of my other hand. Nothing happened. My dream self just stood there, breathing normally, my finger meeting the solid resistance of my palm. A sliver of cold panic pierced the warm tranquility of my dream. I was stuck. "Dr. Finch?" I said, and my dream voice sounded thin and distant. Instantly his voice was there, not through the headphones, but all around me, a calm, disembodied presence in the dream itself. "It's all right, Leo. You're simply in a deeper state of somnolence than ever before. This is a breakthrough. Do not fight it. Just observe. I will guide you back when it's time." His reassurance worked. The panic subsided. I trusted him. He was the expert. When he finally did count me down and I opened my eyes in his dimly lit office, I felt exhausted, as if I'd run a marathon. "A tremendous success," he said, his eyes gleaming behind his glasses. "You've achieved complete immersion. Your conscious and subconscious minds are finally speaking the same language." But a seed of doubt had been planted. The experience hadn't felt like a breakthrough. It had felt like a loss of control. I tried to reduce the frequency of my sessions, telling him I felt so much better that I probably didn't need them as often. He smiled a gentle, paternal smile. "As you wish, Leo. But the narrative is still fragile. It's best to reinforce it regularly." He was right. The nights I didn't have a session, the old terrors began to creep back in at the edges. Not the full-blown nightmares of before, but a subtle wrongness. A book in my library would be open to a page of nonsense text. A shadow on the beach would seem to move on its own. It was as if my subconscious, left to its own devices, was still trying to tell a horror story. I felt a desperate, clawing need for the therapy, for the safety of Finch's guided dreams. It was no longer a cure, it was an addiction. The true fear began when the dream world started to bleed into the waking one. I'd be at my desk at work and catch the scent of old books and leather when there was none. I'd look out my office window, and for a split second, I'd see a turquoise ocean instead of the gray cityscape. These moments were disorienting, and they were happening more and more often. I felt like I was living with one foot in each world, and the ground beneath me was becoming increasingly unstable. The mundane reality was fraying like old worn cloth, and the vibrant threads of the dream were pushing through. One afternoon, I was staring at a coffee stain on my desk, a perfectly ordinary brown, dried-up splodge, and I watched, my heart sinking in my chest as it shimmered. For a terrifying fraction of a second, the stain resolved itself not as coffee, but as the intricate, almost phosphorescent pattern of sand dollars at the tide line of my dream beach. I blinked, rubbed my eyes hard, and it was a coffee stain again. But the terror lingered, cold and absolute. I was losing my grip. I was beginning to forget which world was the default. The only thing that felt completely, reliably real was the velvety comfort of that armchair in the library, and that terrified me most of all. I was becoming conditioned to prefer the cage. Driven by this new anxiety, a sharp, cold wedge of panic in my gut, I did what I should have done from the beginning. I started researching Dr. Alastair Finch, not the glowing testimonials on his professional website, the ones that read like advertisements for a spiritual awakening, but a deep dive into news archives, medical registries, and public records. I felt like a detective in a cheap, desperate thriller, hunched over my laptop at 3 in the morning, the harsh blue light the only thing keeping the shadows of sleep at bay. What I found made my blood run cold and coagulate in my veins. My fingers, slick with sweat, trembled over the trackpad. Dr. Finch had previously run a wellness retreat in upstate New York that had been shut down after an investigation into the mysterious death of a client, a woman named Eleanor Vance. The official cause was listed as a cerebral aneurysm, a neat, medically unquestionable end, but an article in a small defunct local paper was still archived online. It quoted an anonymous staff member who spoke of Finch's radical theories and prolonged sensory deprivation experiments, describing sessions that lasted not hours but entire days, the patients isolated, subjected only to his voice and the binaural hum. The staff member had said chillingly, he kept saying he was helping her transcend. Then I found a forum for families of missing persons and the emotionally desolate posts within it. And I saw his name again. 2 other families, separated by years and geography, mentioned that their loved ones, both of whom had suffered from severe treatment-resistant sleep disorders, had been patients of Dr. Finch shortly before they simply stopped. They hadn't died. They had fallen into unexplained persistent comas. The medical term was PVS, persistent vegetative state. The authorities had found no evidence of malpractice, no drugs, no blunt trauma. The patients were physically healthy, their hearts beating, their lungs breathing, but their minds, they were simply gone, locked behind a pair of vacant, unblinking eyes. They were, according to the families, resting peacefully, eternally. The final piece of the puzzle, the key that turned the lock and let the horror flood in, clicked into place when I found a digitized copy of a paper he had written for a small, obscure psychology journal 20 years earlier, buried deep in an academic database. It was titled The Somnolent Prison, Deconstructing the Fallacy of Waking Consciousness. I read the abstract, my own breath hitching in my throat, my eyes burning. In it, he argued with cold, meticulous academic precision that the wakened world was a chaotic, painful, and ultimately meaningless prison for the human mind. He theorized that the sensory overload, the pain, the relentless demands of the body were merely distractions from what he believed was the only true form of existence, the subconscious, the dream state. True consciousness, he claimed, was a purer, more powerful form of life, one that could only be accessed through complete and permanent immersion. His hypothesis was that the body was merely a temporary flawed vessel. The paper ended with a single chilling, triumphant sentence that felt like a sentence delivered to me. The therapist's ultimate duty is not to tether the consciousness to the crude vessel of the body, but to facilitate its final beautiful liberation into the boundless architecture of the mind. He wasn't curing his patients, he was collecting them. He was a zookeeper of souls, carefully curating a private eternal audience for himself, and his dream weaving wasn't a therapy, it was the net. The lucid anchor wasn't a safe place for me, it was the chain that held me to my cell. I knew, with a certainty that settled in my bones like ice, that I couldn't just stop going. The dependence was too deep, the withdrawal already too terrifying. The idea of facing a night without the faint hope of the sanctum, without his guiding voice, felt like plunging into a black, endless ocean without a life raft. The terrors would return, not just the fragmented nightmares, but the raw, unguided horror of a subconscious mind fighting a battle I no longer had the strength to win. No, I had to go back one more time, one last time, not as a patient, but as a spy, an escape artist, to confront him and break the final invisible hold he had on me. I booked my next session, my heart pounding with a cold, hard dread that was worse than any of my old insomnia-fueled anxieties. This was not dread of the dark. This was dread of the light of my own mind being extinguished. The moment I sat in that leather chair, the familiar plush comfort of it now feeling like a velvet-lined trap, and he placed the headphones over my ears, I knew I had made a terrible, fatal mistake. His movements were too precise. The soft, lavender scent and the air was too cloying. He didn't ask about my week. He didn't use the gentle warm-up script. He just looked at me, a strange, proprietary gleam in his kind eyes. The familiar hum was different this time, more insistent, deeper, a powerful subsonic throb that didn't just vibrate in my skull but seemed to be pulling at the very electrical impulses of my brain. His voice began, but before he had even finished his first sentence, "Now, Leo, let us descend into the quiet depths of your beautiful world." I was pulled under. It wasn't a gentle drift, a slow sinking into warm water. It was a violent, nauseating plunge, a feeling of being ripped from one reality and slammed disoriented into another. I was in my library, but the sacred geometry of the place, the perfection I had painstakingly built, was horribly corrupted. The fire in the hearth was burning with a cold, unnatural blue flame that cast no warmth, but only stark, sterile shadows. The vast domed ceiling that I had designed to be a window to a calm, starry night sky was dark, the stars not twinkling, but fixed, dead pinpricks in a void of absolute blackness. And standing by the fireplace, holding a book with a smooth black cover that reflected no light, was Dr. Alastair Finch. Not his voice in the air, his physical form dressed in a familiar, neatly tailored tweed jacket, looking as solid, as real, and infinitely more menacing than he ever did in his office. "Hello, Leo," he said, and his voice was no longer soft and gentle. It was crisp, authoritative, and laced with a chilling disappointment, the tone of a disappointed master talking to a favorite misbehaving pet. "I had truly hoped you would embrace the transition more willingly. You have such a magnificent mind, a breathtaking space you constructed. It's so much more pleasant for everyone when you don't struggle." What is this? I demanded, scrambling out of the velvet armchair, my dream voice shaking, sounding thin and small against the vast, silent room. Where am I? You are home, he said, with a sweeping, possessive gesture around a grand, silent room. You are where you've always wanted to be, free from the pain, the noise, the crude, exhausting demands, and the ultimate decay of the waking world. You are finally safe. He took a slow, deliberate step toward me, and I took an instinctive step back. You were so close to achieving total, peaceful somnolence. Why did you look outside? You've trapped me, I whispered, the horrifying truth settling upon me like a shroud made of cold, stiff silk. My own creation, my sanctum, was a magnificent, beautiful cage. He smiled, a thin, passionless upturning of the lips that didn't reach his cold eyes. I have liberated you. Your body is resting peacefully in my clinic, Leo. It is being cared for. It no longer needs to trouble you with its crude, painful demands. It is a vessel, beautifully empty, but necessary to house the apparatus that keeps your consciousness here, safe, in the dream. I tried to force myself awake, to claw my way back to reality, using every fiber of will I had left. I focused on the feeling of the leather chair, trying to find the texture of his office, the smell of lavender and old books. But the dream was total, seamless, a perfect simulacrum of reality. I was a ghost, my conscious self a useless passenger in my own mind. I ran to one of the large mahogany doors, the one that usually led to the sun-drenched beach, and threw it open with a desperate surge of adrenaline. There was no beach. There was only an endless, swirling gray void, a visual and sensory emptiness that stretched on forever. And from within that emptiness, I heard the faint, whimpering, sorrowful sounds of other voices, wordless and broken. They are the others, Finch said from directly behind me, his proximity a horrifying violation. His voice was devoid of all the warmth and compassion he had cultivated in his office. The ones who didn't appreciate the gift I gave them, they created such beautiful worlds too, you know. Gardens, mountains, even a whole miniature city. But they insisted on clinging to their pathetic little lives, their debts, their minor ailments. They fought the peace. Eventually, the mind must be disciplined. Don't make the same mistake, Leo. I turned and looked around the library again, and in the deepest, most shadowed corners of the towering shelves, I started to notice things I hadn't before. Between the magnificent stacks, blending with the shifting shadows of the cold blue fire, there were other figures. They were translucent, shimmering, their outlines indistinct, like heat haze. Their faces were vacant, their postures listless, their eyes staring into the middle distance, utterly, profoundly alone. They were his collection, his other patients. We were all beautiful prisoners in his curated afterlife, a private exhibition of captured minds. A cold, primal rage rose up in me, a burning, protective fire that overrode the soul-crushing terror. He had taken my life, stolen my mind, and sealed me away. I would not be one of his docile, shimmering exhibits. I had to fight. But how do you fight the architect, the god of your own dream? Not with dream logic, I realized, not with force or with a fictional weapon. I had to fight him with the one thing he had demonized and tried to erase from me, reality. He wanted me to forget the waking world, to let its pain and chaos fade away until it became the pale, unconvincing shadow of my dream. That was his power. So I had to remember. I closed my eyes, shutting out the cold, beautiful mockery of my sanctum at the sight of his satisfied spectral form, and I focused. I didn't think, I felt. I summoned the most powerful, mundane, irritating, and real sensations I could, the raw, unpolished grit of the waking world. I summoned the sharp, bitter, metallic taste of the cheap, day-old coffee from the AE office machine that always scorched my tongue. I summoned the rough, scratchy texture of my cat sandpaper tongue on my hand, the wet, unpleasant warmth of it. I focused on the specific off-key, tinny jingle of the ice cream truck on my street in the humid summer, a melody so annoying it was an anchor. I called up the dense, humid, ozone-charged smell of rain on hot asphalt on a city street, a smell that meant traffic and inconvenience. "What are you doing? Stop this childish attempt at self-sabotage." Finch's voice was sharp, laced with genuine alarm, an emotion he had hidden so well before. I ignored him. I focused on the sickening, tight feeling of a sudden, brutal migraine behind my eyes. I focused on the feeling of a sunburn on my shoulders, the tight, peeling agony of it, the sting of cheap, perfumed soap in my eye, the annoying, persistent, rhythmic drip, drip, drip of a leaky faucet that had kept me up for nights, the pain, the flaws, the sheer obstinate inconvenience of reality. These were my life rafts, my unbreakable anchors. The library around me began to flicker violently. The dark mahogany shelves wavered, the books blurring like watercolors in the rain. The cold blue fire sputtered and crackled with a sound like breaking glass. I could feel a pulling sensation, a violent, sickening lurching that was a faint, tenuous connection to something distant and solid. My body, my real, breathing, messy body. "Stop it! Now, Leo!" Finch screamed, and his calm, paternal facade completely shattered. His form began to distort, melting like wax in a hot room, his carefully composed face stretching into a distorted, screaming mask of pure rage. "You ungrateful child, I gave you paradise. You cannot leave the structure. It is complete." I opened my eyes, and he was lunging for me, no longer a kind old therapist, but a twisted, monstrous thing of pure fury and violated ownership. He was a creature who had been interrupted at his eternal meal, but he was too late. I held on to the memory of a splinter I'd gotten under my thumbnail last week, the tiny, sharp, exquisitely real, undeniable pain of it. I focused on the feel of the tiny piece of wood against my living flesh, and I pulled with everything I had. With a sound like tearing fabric, a violent, deafening rah-pee, the world of the dream shattered into a million pieces of black, shimmering glass. The sound was so loud it was physically painful. The darkness swallowed me, and then, a split second later, I woke up with a violent chest-heaving gasp, my body convulsing in the leather chair. I was back in his office. The headphones were on the floor, sparking faintly. The air was heavy, charged with a horrible residual energy. Dr. Finch was standing over me, his face a mask of cold, concentrated fury, his silver beard slightly mussed, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. The wire-rimmed glasses were gone, and his eyes, magnified and bare, were simply black, bottomless pits of shock and hate. For a moment, a lifetime of silence, we just stared at each other. The kindly, tranquil therapist was gone, and in his place was a predator whose most prized piece of prey had just used its own flesh to escape the trap. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The knowledge of what he was passed between us like a physical suffocating wave. I scrambled out of the chair, my legs weak and trembling, but moving, real, and I stumbled, crawling, out of the room, past the gurgling, mocking fountain, out of the clinic, and into the shocking, brilliant, painful light of the afternoon sun, the sounds of the city, the screech of tires, the cacophony of traffic, the people talking on their phones, a distant, insistent siren. They were the most beautiful, most real, most glorious symphony I had ever heard. I was awake. I was alive. I was free. But the story doesn't end there. I am free, but I am not cured. The opposite. Now, I am terrified of sleep, 1,000 times more than before. Every single night is a battle of attrition, a siege on my own mind. I drink coffee until my hands shake so badly I can barely hold the mug. I keep every light on in my apartment, blazing white against the dark. I'll monitor my cat's breathing to make sure I'm still hearing the sound of my own waking world. I know that if I close my eyes, if I let my guard down for a single second, the darkness will find the flaw I created, the open door in the architecture of my mind, and I will be pulled back into that silent, magnificent library. Because sometimes, in that fleeting, fragile moment, just before the crushing wave of unwilling exhaustion finally drags me into unconsciousness, I can still hear him, his voice no longer in my head, but whispering from the dark, cold corners of my room, from the world behind my eyelids. It's a soft, patient, venomous whisper, dripping with eternal certainty and disappointment. The door's still open, Leo. You can still come home. So much more peaceful here. Sooner or later, everyone sleeps. The woods behind the cabin weren't just woods, they were an ocean. A deep, green, silent ocean of ancient pines and forgotten maples, and I had been drowning in it for 3 months. My wife, Eleanor, had always called me a creature of the city, a man who found comfort in the predictable grid of streets and the constant reassuring hum of other people's lives. She was right. The silence of the forest was a physical thing, a pressure against my eardrums, a constant reminder of the much larger silence she had left behind in my life. I came here to write, or at least that was the official story, the one I told my concerned friends and my well-meaning but utterly bewildered parents. I was a novelist, and novelists, according to cliché, are supposed to retreat to rustic cabins to wrestle with their muse, but my muse had died in a sterile beige hospital room 6 months ago. Her final breath, a quiet, unassuming sigh that had somehow sucked all the oxygen out of my world. I didn't come here to write. I came here to disappear. My name is Thomas Weaver, and I was a ghost haunting the life I had failed to save. My days were a featureless landscape of aimless wandering. I would walk for hours, following deer trails that petered out into nothing, my feet sinking into a thick carpet of pine needles and decaying leaves. The forest was a living, breathing archive of death and rebirth, a cycle I could observe but no longer feel a part of. It was on one of these walks, pushing deeper into the woods than I ever had before, that I found it. I was following the ghost of a creek, a dry, rocky bed that snaked its way through a particularly dense thicket of ironwood trees. The air grew still and heavy, the usual chorus of bird song and insect chatter, fading into an unnerving silence. And then I saw it, standing in a small, unnaturally perfect clearing. It was a door, not the ruin of a door, not the last remnant of some long-forgotten homestead. It was a perfect, freestanding door, unconnected to any wall, any foundation, any structure at all. It was made of a dark, almost black wood, polished to a deep, lustrous sheen that seemed to drink the dappled sunlight. It was set in a simple, unadorned frame of the same wood, which simply rose from the forest floor and ended, a perfect, impossible rectangle of civilization, in the heart of the wild. The doorknob was a heavy, ornate thing of tarnished brass, fashioned in the shape of a sleeping serpent devouring its own tail. My first thought was that it was an art installation, some strange surrealist project left to be reclaimed by nature. I walked around it. The back was as solid and seamless as the front. There were no hinges visible, no seams in the frame. It was a solid, impossible object, as out of place as a cathedral in the middle of the desert. I reached out and touched the wood. It was cool and smooth, vibrating with a low, almost subsonic hum that I felt more in my teeth than in my fingertips. I gripped the brass serpent and turned. Nothing. The knob wouldn't budge. I pushed, then pulled. The door was as solid and immovable as the ancient bedrock beneath my feet. It became my obsession, my secret pilgrimage. Every day I would walk to the clearing and visit the door. I would sit on a fallen log and just look at it, this beautiful, maddening enigma. It was a focal point for my grief, a perfect metaphor for my own life, a locked door to a place I could no longer enter. I would talk to it, my voice a raw, quiet whisper in the silent clearing. I would tell it about Eleanor, about the way she would bite her lip when she was concentrating, about the smell of her hair after a summer rain. I was a man confessing his sins to a wooden god, and the forest was my silent, indifferent cathedral. The first time it opened, it was an accident. I was in town, a small, weary-looking place called Black Creek, picking up supplies at the general store. The woman behind the counter, a kindly, grandmotherly type named Martha, was talking in hushed tones to another customer. Old Mr. Abernathy, a man who had lived in the valley his entire 94 years, had passed away peacefully in his sleep the night before. I didn't think much of it. It was the kind of sad, inevitable news that is the lifeblood of any small town. But when I returned to the cabin, the compulsion to see the door was overwhelming. I walked through the woods, my mind a numb, gray fog. As I stepped into the clearing, I felt a change in the air. The low, humming vibration was more intense, a palpable thrum that seemed to make the very leaves on the trees tremble. On a whim, born of nothing more than the ritualistic habit of my daily visits, I walked up to the door and placed my hand on the brass serpent. I turned. This time it moved. With a soft, sighing click, the latch disengaged. The door swung inward, silently, revealing not the forest behind it, but an impossible, shimmering darkness. It wasn't the darkness of a moonless night. It was a deeper, more absolute black, a velvet void that seemed to absorb all light and sound. And from it, a scent wafted out, a scent that hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was the smell of cinnamon, old books, and Eleanor's favorite Earl Grey tea. It was the smell of Sunday mornings in our tiny, sun-drenched city apartment. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild, terrified bird. This was impossible, a hallucination, a trick of my grief-addled mind. But the smell was so real, so painfully, perfectly real. I took a hesitant step forward and peered inside. I saw nothing, just the endless, soft black. But I could feel it, the warmth of the morning sun on the worn wooden floorboards, the weight of our old patchwork quilt, the faint, distant sound of traffic 5 stories below. And then I heard it, her laughter, a light, airy sound that had been the soundtrack to the best years of my life. It wasn't a memory of her laughter. It was the thing itself, a perfect, resonant echo in the impossible space beyond the door. Tears streamed down my face. I took another step, my hand outstretched, wanting to plunge into that perfect sensory memory, to wrap myself in it, to drown in it. But a sudden, primal fear, a deep, instinctual sense of self-preservation held me back. This was wrong. This was a violation of the fundamental laws of the universe. I stumbled back, my heel catching on a root. I fell hard, scrambling away from the open door like a frightened animal. As soon as I was outside the immediate circle of the clearing, the door swung shut with the same soft, final click. I scrambled to my feet and rushed back to it, grabbing the knob, pushing, pulling. It was locked, solid, immovable. The smell was gone. The feeling of warmth was gone. The sound of her laughter was gone. I was alone again in the cold, silent woods. It took me 2 days to make the connection. 2 days of frantic, sleepless obsession, replaying the event in my mind over and over. The door, Mr. Abernathy, the timing. It was a hypothesis so insane, so monstrous, that my rational mind rejected it outright. But the part of me that had seen the impossible, that had smelled a ghost of a perfect Sunday morning, knew it was the truth. The door only opened when someone died. The thought was a venomous, seductive whisper in the back of my mind. I became a ghoul, a vulture of sorrow. I bought a small, cheap police scanner, the kind used by local news reporters and morbid hobbyists. I would sit in my cabin for hours, the static hissing, listening for the coded language of tragedy. A car crash on the interstate, a heart attack at the diner, a hunting accident in the state forest. My grief for Eleanor became twisted, perverted into a hungry, desperate anticipation for the grief of others. I was a man praying for funerals, not so that I could mourn, but so that I could get my fix. Each time a death was reported, I would race to the clearing, my heart pounding with a sick, shameful excitement. And each time the door would be waiting, the low hum, the soft click, the welcoming darkness, and each time the memory would be different. A fatal car crash on Highway 17 brought me the memory of our first date, the taste of the cheap red wine we'd shared, the feeling of a hand, nervous and electric, in my own. The death of a hiker who'd fallen from Black Creek Falls gave me the scent of the salty air on our honeymoon in Maine, the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks. The door was a curator of my happiest moments, a library of my lost life, and the price of admission was a stranger's death. I was an addict. The real world became a gray, washed-out waiting room, a place I had to endure between my visits to the vibrant, perfect world beyond the door. The novel I was supposed to be writing lay untouched. I stopped answering calls from my family. I grew thin, my eyes taking on a haunted, feverish glint. The townspeople in Black Creek began to look at me differently, their friendly smiles replaced with wary, cautious glances. I was the strange, gaunt man from the city who bought too much canned food and seemed to be listening to something no one else could hear. And then the deaths stopped. For 3 weeks, the scanner was silent. The town of Black Creek, with a stubborn, infuriating resilience, refused to offer up a sacrifice. The door remained locked. I was in withdrawal. And it was an agony far worse than the initial raw grief. The memories, which had been a comfort, were now a torment, a paradise I had been exiled from. My grief, which I had thought I was processing, came roaring back, amplified and distorted. The door hadn't been healing me. It had been enabling me, keeping me in a state of suspended animation, a perfect, preserved stasis of sorrow. I became desperate. I would spend all day at the door, pleading with it, sometimes screaming at it until my throat was raw, my fists bloody from pounding on the unyielding wood. The silence of the forest mocked me. It was during one of these desperate, frantic visits that I found the bird. It was a small brown sparrow lying at the base of the door, its wing bent at an unnatural angle. It was still alive, its tiny chest heaving, its black, bead-like eyes filled with a silent animal terror. A thought, ugly and reptilian, slithered into my mind. I tried to push it away, but it was too strong. The addiction was too strong. I told myself it was a mercy. The bird was dying anyway. It was a kindness. My hands trembled as I picked it up. Its tiny heart beat a frantic, terrified rhythm against my palm. I closed my eyes, and with a quick, brutal twist, I broke its neck. The fragile bones snapped with a sound that was horrifyingly loud in the silent clearing. I stood there for a long moment, the small, warm, limp body in my hand, a wave of self-loathing so profound it almost buckled my knees. I had crossed a line. I had taken a life, however small, for my own selfish, pathetic need. With a trembling hand I reached for the doorknob. It turned. The door swung open. The scent of cinnamon and old books washed over me. But it was different this time. Fainter. The feeling of warmth was gone, replaced by a subtle, creeping chill. And Eleanor's laughter. It had a thin, brittle quality, an echo of an echo. It was a flawed, corrupted memory, a cheap imitation. I stumbled back, the dead bird falling from my numb fingers. I understood then. The door was not just a passive gateway. It was a connoisseur. It was a parasite that fed on death, and the quality of its meal mattered. The peaceful, natural death of an old man, the sudden, tragic death of a stranger, these were one thing. The deliberate, cold-blooded killing of an innocent creature was another. The door had opened, but it was punishing me. It was telling me that the price for a perfect memory was higher. It wanted a more significant sacrifice. The next few months were a descent into a private, methodical madness. I became a hunter. I started with small animals, squirrels caught in traps, a raccoon by the side of the road that I mercifully put out of its misery with a tire iron. Each time I would justify it, a mercy, a kindness. And each time I would run to the door, a desperate, pathetic supplicant, and each time the memory of Eleanor would be a little more faded, a little more distorted, a little more soulless. The door was starving, and I was feeding it scraps. It was making me hungrier, more desperate. The day I found the deer was the day I knew I was lost. It had been caught in a barbed wire fence at the edge of my property, its leg torn and bloody, its eyes wide with panic and pain. It was a large, beautiful buck, full of a powerful wildlife force, and my first thought, the one that rose unbidden from the dark, twisted pit of my soul, was, "This one will be enough." I went back to the cabin and got the hunting rifle that had come with the rental, a dusty relic I hadn't even known was there. I told myself the same lie. It was a mercy. I couldn't let it suffer, but as I raised the rifle, my hand steady, my eye looking down the sight, I knew it was not about mercy. It was about me. It was about my need. The shot was deafening, a profane violation of the forest's sacred quiet. The deer fell, and as I stood over its magnificent dying body, watching the life drain from its dark liquid eyes, I felt nothing, no pity, no remorse, just the cold, clinical anticipation of the addict about to get his fix. I left the deer where it lay and ran to the clearing. The humming of the door was a triumphant, resonant thrum. I turned the knob. It swung open. The memory was perfect. It was our wedding day, the scent of the white roses in Eleanor's bouquet, the feeling of the cool gold ring on my finger, the sound of her voice as she said her vows, strong and clear and full of a love that I had believed was eternal. It was so real, so powerful, that I fell to my knees, sobbing, completely lost in the sensory perfection of the moment. When the door closed, and I was once again on my knees in the dirt and the cold, I knew with a chilling, absolute certainty what the door wanted next. The progression was logical, inevitable. It wanted a human life. It wanted me to become a monster. And the most terrifying part was that a part of me was considering it. The town of Black Creek was full of old, lonely people, people who might not be missed. The thought was a flash of pure demonic insanity, and I recoiled from it, horrified at the thing I was becoming. I was a man trapped in a feedback loop of grief and horror, and the only escape seemed to be to descend deeper. I decided to leave, to run. I packed my car in a frantic, paranoid haze, throwing my books and clothes into the back seat. I would drive west. I would never stop. I would put a continent between myself and that cursed clearing. I just had to visit it one last time. I had to say goodbye, not to the door, but to her. I walked through the woods, a man on his way to his own execution. I felt hollowed out, a husk. I stepped into the clearing. The door was waiting, and I knew, with the sudden, soul-shattering clarity, what the final, perfect sacrifice would have to be. Not a stranger, not an old man from town. Me, my own life, the ultimate offering, the final perfect death that would surely purchase the final perfect memory, not just a fleeting sensory echo, but the thing itself. An eternity with her, in that perfect, sun-drenched room beyond the door. It was a transaction, my miserable, grief-stricken life in exchange for an eternity of manufactured happiness. It seemed like a fair trade. I had the rifle with me. I had brought it to protect myself on the road. Another lie in a long, pathetic chain of them. I raised the barrel and placed it under my chin, my finger finding the cold, smooth curve of the trigger. My eyes were fixed on the door. I was ready. I was willing. "Don't, Tom." The voice was a whisper, a rustle of leaves, but it was her voice. It was Eleanor's voice. It had come not from the door, but from behind me. I lowered the rifle, my heart seizing in my chest, and turned. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the shadows of the ancient pines. It was not the vibrant, sun-kissed Eleanor of my memories. This was a pale, translucent echo of her, her form wavering like a heat haze, her eyes filled not with love, but with a profound, bottomless sorrow. "Eleanor?" I breathed. The name a prayer, a curse. "It's a trap, Tom," she whispered, her voice a fragile, distant thing. "It's not a memory. It's a cage. It feeds on life, but it traps the echo of a soul. Every time you open that door, you fed it, and you twisted my key in its lock." I stared at her, my mind refusing to comprehend. "What are you talking about? I was with you." "You were with a lure," she said, a single, translucent tear tracing a path down her spectral cheek, a puppet made from your own memories and my stolen essence. It's a parasite, a lonely, ancient thing that has been here since the first tree fell in this forest. It promises comfort, but it only offers oblivion. It promises reunion, but it only creates prisoners. Your death would be the final lock on the door. It would give it both of us forever. The truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. The beautiful, perfect memories were a lie, a bait. I had not been visiting my wife. I had been desecrating her memory, feeding her soul piece by piece to a monstrous, timeless entity. My grief had not been a key. It had been the hook on which I had been caught. The door behind me began to hum, a low, angry, possessive sound. It knew I was being swayed. The air grew cold. What do I do? I cried, looking from the ghost of my wife to the terrible, beautiful door. Live, she whispered, her form beginning to fade. Live for both of us, Tom, the real way, the hard way, and let me go. She was gone. I was alone in the clearing with a humming, hungry door, and for the first time in a year, I knew what I had to do. I was faced with a choice, a swift, easy death that would lead to an eternity in a beautiful, gilded cage, or a long, hard life filled with the real, painful, and ultimately cleansing fire of true grief. I chose the fire. I didn't run. I walked back to the cabin, my steps heavy but firm. I gathered the cans of gasoline I had for the generator and the axe from the woodshed. I returned to the clearing, a man with a purpose for the first time since Eleanor had died. I stood before the door, the source of all my monstrous actions, the altar of my twisted worship. I could feel its rage, its hunger. It was trying to lure me one last time, sending out the faint scent of cinnamon and old books. But it smelled like a lie now. It smelled like death. I swung the axe. The blade bit deep into the dark, polished wood, which screamed with a sound that was not wood, but a chorus of 1,000 trapped, tormented voices. I swung again and again, the wood splintering, a dark, viscous, sap-like substance bleeding from the wounds. I doused it in gasoline and threw a single lit match. The door erupted in a pillar of black, greasy smoke and an unnatural violet-colored flame. The screams from within it grew to a deafening crescendo, the voices of all its victims, all its prisoners, finally being released in a fiery, agonizing exorcism. I saw faces in the flames, fleeting, contorted masks of pain, and finally, of peace. And for a fraction of a second, I saw Eleanor, not the pale, sad echo from the woods, but the real Eleanor, her face full of light and love, her lips forming a single, silent word. Thank you. I stood there until the fire burned itself out, leaving nothing but a patch of scorched earth and a lingering foul smell that the clean forest air quickly carried away. The door was gone. The clearing was just clearing again. The silence was no longer a pressure. It was just silence. I left the cabin that day. I drove back to the city, back to the grid, back to the comforting, messy, and imperfect world of the living. The grief is still with me. It is a part of me now, a scar that will never fully fade. But it is a clean wound, not the festering, infected thing the door had made it. Sometimes, in my quiet moments, I remember the feel of the memories the door offered, their perfect, seductive beauty. And I understand that the greatest horrors are not the ones that threaten to kill us, but the ones that offer us a reason to stop living. I chose to live. I chose the pain. I chose the real, flawed, and beautiful memory of my wife, the one I carry inside me, the one that no locked door can ever contain or ever take away. I joined a sleep study. Everyone else disappeared on night 3. The flyer was a small, unassuming rectangle of cheap, glossy paper, tacked to the overstuffed bulletin board in the graduate student lounge. It was a beacon of bland, institutional hope in a sea of roommate-wanted ads and free pizza for your soul campus ministry flyers. Participants needed for a study on the restorative effects of deep sleep, it read. The compensation was a number so ludicrous, so disproportionate to the task of simply sleeping, that it felt like a typo. $20,000 for a 1-week inpatient study. To me, a Ph.D. candidate in theoretical physics, a man whose life had become a Sisyphean struggle to pay rent on a grad student stipend while simultaneously trying to solve the mysteries of the universe, that number wasn't just money. It was a lifeline. It was a year of ramen noodles and peace of mind. It was the ability to think about something other than the crushing weight of my own self-imposed and deeply intellectual poverty. My name is Simon. I have always been a man who believed in data, in quantifiable and observable reality. The world, to me, was a complex but ultimately solvable equation. I did not believe in ghosts or in magic or in any phenomenon that could not be explained by the elegant and sometimes brutal laws of physics. This, I would later realize, was a profound and deeply arrogant failure of my imagination. The study was being conducted by a private and vaguely sinister research group called the Somnos Institute. Their intake facility was a stark, minimalist, and deeply unnerving office in a downtown skyscraper, a place that smelled of expensive and probably toxic air freshener. The man in charge was a Dr. Elias Vance, a man with the cold, dead eyes of a shark and a smile that was a masterpiece of insincere corporate reassurance. He spoke in a smooth, practiced baritone, his words a soothing and utterly meaningless river of scientific jargon. The Somnus Protocol, he explained, his hands clasped on his large mahogany desk, is designed to isolate and amplify the theta wave activity in the brain during REM sleep. We believe that this specific frequency is the key to unlocking the human mind's latent and largely untapped potential for self-repair, for accelerated learning, for a kind of psychic decluttering, if you will. He made it sound like we were about to receive a deluxe neurological spa treatment. I and the other 4 participants were chosen for our unremarkable and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and we were chosen for our normality. We were a motley but uniformly healthy and psychologically stable crew. There was Maya, a sharp, cynical, and deeply sarcastic law student. Ben, a quiet, gentle, and deeply introverted software engineer. Chloe, a bubbly and relentlessly optimistic yoga instructor. And Marcus, a former soldier, with a quiet, watchful, and deeply intimidating presence. We were 5 ordinary people, united by our shared and desperate need for a large and seemingly easy sum of money. The facility itself was in the sub-basement of the same skyscraper, a place that was accessible only by a private keycard-operated elevator. As the doors hissed shut behind us, sealing us in, I felt a familiar and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and a flicker of claustrophobia. The facility was a self-contained and windowless world of soft, ambient lighting, recycled and slightly metallic tasting air, and a profound and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and a silence that was not the absence of noise, but the presence of a powerful and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it was a controlled silence. We were each assigned a small, comfortable, and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it was a sterile room. The bed was a marvel of biometric technology, its mattress a complex and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it was a web of sensors that would monitor our every heartbeat, our every breath, our every neurological flicker, a small, unobtrusive, and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and a camera was mounted in the corner of the ceiling, its single, black, and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and its unblinking eye a constant and silent observer. The first 2 nights were a model of scientific and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and a boring routine. We would eat a bland but nutritionally perfect meal in the communal area. We would undergo a battery of cognitive tests, memory games, and logic puzzles. And then we would retire to our individual pods to sleep, a thin and almost invisible IV line taped to our arms, delivering what Dr. Vance had called a proprietary theta wave enhancing amino acid solution. The sleep was incredible. It was a deep, dreamless, and profoundly and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it was a restful abyss. I would wake up feeling a clarity, a focus that I hadn't experienced since my undergraduate, and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and my Adderall-fueled days. The others reported the same. We were sharper, faster, and our scores on the cognitive tests were improving at an exponential rate. The $20,000 felt less like a payment and more like a bonus for a life-altering and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and a very expensive and very effective and very, very strange and very, very strange and very, very strange, and it was a good sleep. The change occurred on the third night. I woke up as usual to the soft, gentle, and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and a chime that signaled the beginning of our waking cycle. I felt the same, profound and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and I felt the same clarity. I sat up. The IV had been disconnected, as it always was, by some silent and unseen and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and a mechanism. I went to the communal area for breakfast. The room was empty. The table was set for 5, as it always was, with 5 identical bowls of the same bland and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and the same oatmeal-like paste. I waited. Ben was usually the first one up, a creature of quiet and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and a creature of habit. Then Chloe and Maya. Marcus was always the last. I waited for 20 minutes. The silence in the room was no longer the controlled and sterile silence of the facility. It was a deep and profound and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it was an empty silence. I went to Ben's room. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open. The room was empty. The bed was made the same, perfect and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and the same military precision neatness as my own. I checked the other rooms, Maya's, Chloe's, Marcus's. They were all empty. Their beds were all made. Their few personal belongings, a book, a tube of chapstick, a pair of running shoes, were all gone. It was as if they had never been there. My first thought was that this was a part of the study, a psychological test, a test of my reaction to sudden and unexplained isolation. It was a logical and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it was a rational explanation. I went to the main door, the one that led to the elevator, to the outside world. I had expected it to be locked. It was not. It opened with a soft and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it hissed open. I stepped out into the elevator lobby. The elevator was there, its doors open, waiting. I stepped inside. I pressed the button for the ground floor. The doors closed, and the elevator began its ascent. I was free to go. The thought was not a comforting one. It was a deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it was a terrifying one. If this was a test, it was a very strange one. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby of the skyscraper. The morning sun was streaming through the large plate glass windows, and the city was a bustling and beautiful and wonderfully and finally, blessedly, real and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically. And it was a normal city. No one stopped me. No one questioned me. I walked out of the building and onto the street. The air was cool, and it smelled of exhaust fumes and roasted nuts and the thousand other beautiful and wonderful, and finally, blessedly, real and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and the smells of life. I was free. The $20,000 had been wired to my account that morning as promised. The study was over. I was a free and very rich man. But the others, where were the others? I went to the police. I tried to explain. My voice was a shaky and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and it was an unconvincing mess. 4 missing people from a secret and vaguely sinister sleep study. The officer looked at me with a mixture of suspicion and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and he looked at me with pity. He took a report. He promised to look into it. I knew he would not. I went home, to my own small and cluttered and blessedly real and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and my apartment, and I began my own investigation. The Somnus Institute, it turned out, did not exist. The address of their corporate office was a mail drop. Their website was a shell, a collection of stock photos and meaningless corporate jargon. The phone number was disconnected. The entire organization had, like my fellow participants, vanished into thin air. I was alone with the mystery, and with the $20,000, and with the strange, new, and deeply, and profoundly, and unsettlingly, and strangely, and beautifully, and tragically, and comically, and the new clarity in my own mind. The dreams started that night. They were not dreams in the traditional sense. They were visits. I would find myself in a place that was not a place, a landscape of pure, white, and endless light. And they would be there, Maya, Ben, Chloe, Marcus. They were not ghosts. They were solid. They were real. But they were different. They were calm, serene. Their eyes, which in the real world had been filled with the usual human and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and their eyes were now filled with a deep and profound and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and a placid and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically and a peaceful emptiness. They would not speak to me. They would just be. They would be building things. Strange, intricate, and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and they would be building things out of pure white light. They were architects of a world that was made of dreams, and I was the only one who could see them. I understood then the Somnus Protocol was not about enhancing sleep. It was not about unlocking the mind's potential. It was about something else entirely. It was about migration. Dr. Vance had not been lying when he said he was opening a door, but it was not a door to a new level of consciousness. It was a door to a new place, a new dimension, a world that existed on the other side of sleep, a world that was, perhaps, quieter, simpler, more restful. And the others, they had chosen to stay. They had not disappeared. They had emigrated. They had left the messy and chaotic and beautiful and wonderful and finally blessedly real and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and they had left this world for a world of pure and endless and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and a world of sleep, and I had been the one who had come back. I was the one who had, for some reason, chosen to wake up. I live my life now in two worlds, the waking world with its noise and its chaos and its beautiful and wonderful, and finally, blessedly real and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and its imperfections, and the sleeping world, the world of the endless white and silent light, where my four lost and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and my friends are building their new and quiet and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and their new home. I am a tourist in the land of dreams. I am the last, remaining, and deeply, and profoundly, and unsettlingly, and strangely, and beautifully, and tragically, and comically, and I am the last link to the world they left behind. I do not know if I made the right choice. The quiet, and the peace, and the profound, and deeply, and profoundly, and unsettlingly, and strangely, and beautifully, and tragically, and comically, and the serenity of their world is a powerful, and deeply, and profoundly, and unsettlingly, and strangely, and beautifully, and tragically, and comically, and it is a seductive song. But I am a man of data, a man of the observable world, and this world with all its flaws and all its noise and all its beautiful and wonderful and finally blessedly real and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and this world is the one I have chosen, and I will live in it for them. I will be their memory. I will be their proof that this messy and beautiful and wonderful and finally, blessedly, real and deeply and profoundly and unsettlingly and strangely and beautifully and tragically and comically, and this world was once their home